I'm doing good as well. I'm ready. I'm excited. The one thing I want to ask you about is you've been streaming for how long and you don't have any amazing lo-fi music to start off your stream while it's like live but hasn't actually started yet?
No, I used to have a stream playlist that I would go through back when I was on Twitch, but then when I moved to YouTube, all the stuff was copyrighted. So you can look for copyright-free music, and I actually emailed some game developers that I like asking for creative license to use their songs for my stuff as long as I linked to their games in my channel description. But the issue I
Hmm.
found with that is that people will mute the stream to not have to listen to the music while waiting for me to start talking. But then when I do start talking, they don't realize it because they muted the stream.
Oh, okay. I've only ever gotten positive feedback on my thing, but I have a bit of music playing before, but I understand. Yeah, I understand your decision then.
Yeah, it's
Um,
unfortunate. I do want to though. I feel like there's some nice lo-fi hip hop beats, study, chill, etc., that could be.
to relax and debate too.
Exactly. You know, it's a good lead into whatever bullshit we're going to be talking about on that given day.
Exactly. Yeah, okay. I've set up my thing. Do you have a second camera you can turn on, or is it just the one that you have? Otherwise,
Oh
it's
yeah,
fine. I
hold
can just
on.
go with it.
No, I'm just not used to doing it. Hold on.
All right.
Boop. There you go.
Perfect. Okay. Now let's see if I can set this properly. Amazing. Okay. Cool. All right. Well, I tried one thing actually. I heard there was something going around about you wearing gloves on stream sometime.
Yeah,
And I was
it's
like a big.
you're like way farther north than me. You should understand how high utility it is.
So I tried just now before the stream, and it's terrible. It's horrible. It feels like I have muscle fatigue in all my fingers when
I
I use a keyboard or a mouse with gloves on.
I
It's
guess
actually terrible.
I just have very strong hands. You need
Oh,
the
yeah,
fingerless
fingerless
gloves.
ones.
Yeah, exactly. These nice cheap $3. You can see them fraying right at the fingers so that you're
Uh,
ready for anything.
okay, I see. Okay, I'll look into a pair of that. Should be somebody should start that streaming fingerless gloves. Like specifically, you can have like your channel logo like on the back of the hands. You can show them like this. That
It's a
would be
real
that's a
thing.
good business idea.
There's also I found this while looking up solutions to my hand cold problem. It's from Adderall. It causes a loss of warmth in the extremities. Um,
Okay.
but I found it turns out they actually have it's like this USB plug-in hand warmer. It's like this little mouse shaped thing on your
Okay.
desk, and it just stays at like a 95 degrees, and you just put your hand on it when you're not using your mouse, and it keeps your hand warm, which seems
Okay.
really weird to me, but you know.
It does sound a bit weird. Yeah, is it like does it is it one for you need two then I would imagine for both hands, yeah?
Yeah, you got to dual wield that shit. When you're in like
Yeah,
a when
okay.
you're playing games and you're in like a cutscene or something, you got to like, warm back up with the dual monitor.
Exactly. Yeah, when you're like in between the different speaker time and the debate, you just like warm up your hands before it's time for you to speak again and start doing hand motions. Okay, maybe that would be maybe that'd be something I'll look into if I ever stream from a considerably closer colder place than I am at right now.
We're considering all our options.
Yeah, sure. Okay, yeah. So I'm here mostly to talk to you a bit about your motivation and your reasonings for wanting a like a worker socialist co-op, kind of like mandated society at some point in the future.
Hmm.
And I have a few questions about that and a few ways in which how that like interacts with some previous things you've said in regards to how you decide what you want to advocate for politically and the rest of it. So I guess I can just start with the fairly open-ended question. Why do you want market socialism? Why is that something that you desire and you want us to move towards?
The elimination of the bourgeois as a political class. I think that systems work best when the people who make decisions have the same outcomes as the people who who experience the consequences of those decisions. That the
Hmm.
closer of an alignment there is, the better and more representative of a system you have. And the issue is that right now we have a remarkable amount of economic inequality, not just along income lines, which is, of course, a serious issue, but also along how people make their money and their relationship to the ways in which people make money. namely the Marxian divide, bourgeois proletariat. Obviously, it's more complicated than that in the modern era. We're not all like factory workers and factory owners, but I feel like the basic divide, the fundamental underlying schism is still present, and the
Mhm.
best way to fix the problems which derive from that is to eliminate the schism entirely by putting everyone on the same side of the fence. We can't all be members of the bourgeois, of course, unless you'd consider collective ownership everyone being bourgeois, which is semantic at that point, but
Mhm.
um, we'd all be workers.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So, and then if we take it one step further, then so, um, why do you seek the removal of like a societal bourgeois class?
I think that it's much easier to achieve desirable political outcomes when the people who are in power have shared interests with the people who are not in power. I
Hmm.
think this is the reason why democracy generally tends to lead to better goals or to better outcomes for the majority of people, because
Hmm.
technically a lot of good political stuff could be done under an absolute monarchy. Medicare for
Hmm.
all, like even like a parliamentary system possibly for input, proper housing, like good educational standards. All these things can be done. You don't need a democracy for them. You could have any system, but it's easier to get those things when the people who have the power to make it happen are beholden in some way to the people. I don't think we have that economically. I don't even really think we have that politically, because most politicians are in a bit of a stranglehold. The best way to keep the country stable is to make sure that the economy is functioning properly. In a lot of ways, a modern government really is just uh, a girder, a corset for an economy. I mean, it basically just exists to keep things in line, with a couple of extraneous functions, sort of, to keep the peasantry from revolting. I think we could get much better outcomes if we didn't have that schism.
Okay. Yep. So I also agree that generally democracy does have good outcomes, especially in the political realm. It's very beneficial there, and I do believe that there has been literature that has suggested that co-ops to the capacity that they exist today have specific instances, and fairly broad actually, where they end up having better outcomes, largely on account of their managing structures and the way that they do their business as normal. I agree with that. So I'm gonna ask you a question now, and this is not me necessarily like equating the two or making like a bad faith comparison or whatever. But so why don't you also, for instance, want us to have democracy in, let's say, public transport when it comes to who at any given day will drive the train or the tram or the bus or whatever out of the people who are on the bus at that very moment? Why are you not in favor of democracy in that situation?
There is a gradient for which systems should be directly democratized. You could make this question, I think, about education as well. Like, if you, what, like a university democratic. I think these are reasonable questions to ask, but
Mm-hmm.
the legitimacy of a system being democratized should be tied to the potential outcomes of doing so. And in the case of, say, for example, transportation, I think there are good ways to ensure that the people who drive the buses and plan the routes have shared interests with the people who actually ride them. There are
Mm-hmm.
systems by which you can do that. I mean, all you'd really need to do is have a federally controlled or at least subsidized system where money or funding is granted based on the number of people moved around, and have like local accountability for people voting on whether or not they want a city to expand things this way or the other. That way you have democracy sort of indirectly through government control. And I think that tends to work. There are probably ways to improve on that. But I don't think that issue causes the kind of schisms that you see right now with like the broader economic divide between the working class and the bourgeois. Though, of course, if we fix that problem and it turned out then that there were other subsystems that could be improved through direct democratization, I would look to address that as well.
Yeah, yeah, perfect. And you gave exactly the answer that I expected you to give, and the answer I would give as well, right? It's about outcomes at the end of the day. It's about whether or not the implementation of democracy in a given situation will lead to more desirable outcomes when it comes to how that body or how that thing operates, yeah, insofar as the outcomes produce and insofar as it's able to do what we want it to do societally and what it's supposed to produce. All right, excellent. Then what I'm going to bring into now is why I think that your preemptive arguments in favor of and your kind of like preemptive discussions and advocacy for a co-op mandated economy at some point kind of looks a bit iffy when compared to this desired goal of good outcomes. So right now, we do have quite a bit of research and quite a bit of information about worker cooperatives. However, it is quite limited when it comes to a wide range of things. So, for instance, if we think theoretically and if we base our understanding of worker cooperatives on the literature we have right now and on those potential limitations, I can think of four significant arguments for why a mandate of worker cooperatives can lead to some very, very, very detrimental economic effects that, if that ends up coming to pass, can have really negative outcomes insofar as what the economy is supposed to do. And on those bases, I feel that, like, hey, preemptively being like, I'm in favor of a mandate on worker cooperatives before we have any real idea about the effects that a co-op mandate would have on an economy, kind of betrays the fact that, hey, we're kind of not really arguing from on the basis of we think this will lead to good outcomes, because we really don't know what the outcomes could be, and there are good potential arguments for why the outcomes could be negative in those given instances.
Of course. Though, keep in mind, with regards to the implementation of a full worker cooperative-based system, I do think more research is necessary. It could well be the case that worker cooperatives are not a mode of organization suited to some types of industries, in which case I would want to know that, and if the outcomes were so bad in those cases, I would want to find other ways to supplant the bourgeois in those systems. Of course, worker cooperatives aren't the only way of fixing that problem. You can also just nationalize an industry. That also fixes the issue, assuming the government is democratic, which again is its own set of issues. It's very much an outcomes-driven thing. I think that I think there is always a way to bring business under the heel if you're willing to do so. I would just favor worker cooperatives because it seems like the easiest and most sensible way to do so. This is one of the things in which, unironically, China actually does a better job than we do. In their autocratic fascist management of their own free market economy, they have been known to occasionally get very angry at local businessmen for acting in ways detrimental to the national interest. Now, obviously, the reasons they do this aren't because they want to support the proletariat class. It's because they're nationalists who want to support the interests of China. But that energy, the energy of a government which is hawkishly watching its most powerful, this is something which could be replicated in a democratic society. So I think there are other methods of achieving a comparable degree of class unity, or I should say, class abolition in a good system. I would just want it to be worker co-ops.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm gonna focus us a bit more specifically towards the worker co-op thing to try to make this conversation a bit more, I suppose, like a bit more concise with exactly what we're talking about. So I'm gonna give you the like four arguments that I have right now that are based on our theoretical understanding of the data as it exists right now on worker cooperatives, and how those issues that we can infer based on the literature today could pan out to have really, really negative effects for an economy in the future. And then I'm going to see if you agree with them and if you recognize them as well, or if you disagree, or however we go from there. So the first one, and I would think this is probably the major one, is that right now there is a massive amount of selection bias in the types of people we see working within worker cooperatives today. Because they are so rare, because they are not commonplace, the type of people who are specifically going to seek out a worker cooperative firm to work in are probably going to be people that are vastly more oriented towards more cooperation, towards that type of management and business structure compared to the average person in the population. And we're not sure if the average person in the population would function as well in such a cooperative, business model, and with those structures of management and of decision making and the rest of it. And that's one of the issues we have right now with the research. Because there are so few of them, there is a lot of selection bias when it comes to who is actually in those firms right now, and therefore what consequences and how those firms tend to behave and how they tend to do right now in our current economy. Do you agree with this?
I do. Though it should be noted the same could have been said with political democracy back during the 18th century. When we established democracy here in the States, of course, originally it was only landowning white men. It took us a century and a half to arrive at the conclusion that actually democracy works just fine if essentially everyone over 18 can vote. except I suppose felons in some places, but they should be able to vote too. I agree there's an existing selection bias, though I do think that there are ways to culturally compensate for whatever difference there would be between the people who would self-select for worker cooperative participation and people who wouldn't presently.
I agree that there's definitely more cultural things, especially surrounding work culture as it exists today, that can make the average person more inclined and be able to, want to like desire and operate within those, within cooperative firms more effectively. I mean, just look at the way a lot of business is taught right now. It's very, very individualistic. It's based on, your own personal career growth and cutting ahead of the competition, the Sigma grind set Patrick Bateman moment, that type of attitude around company culture and around how you should behave in the workplace. And obviously a lot of these things are very compatible with worker cooperatives and could be reformed and changed into being more compatible. I 100% agree with that.
People need to be educated for democracy.
Yeah, they educate. Yeah, exactly. Educated for it, where it's just like, hey, if you're expected to collaborate with other people in an economy or in a specific capacity, people need to develop those types of communication skills in order to do so most effectively. It's inarguable. I will take some issue with the comparison here directly to democracy, because when it comes to the democracy of the general political process, it is a lot more difficult to do measured steps in the meantime compared to like feudalism to democracy. However, when it comes to worker cooperatives, there is a lot of middle ground we can cover before we get to the point where it's like, okay, we need to take this step or we don't take the step. So things like potential mandates in more local communities, in specific sectors, in certain supply lines. There's a lot of steps to take in the meantime and see how they function before we jump all the way to entire worker mandates across the whole of the economy as a whole. So I understand the general gist of that comparison, but I do think that there's a lot more ground to cover before it gets to that point where it's like, okay, we just have to take the leap and see what happens.
I agree. The difficulty, of course, is that as long as we live in a system where the bourgeois dictate our educational standards, there's not going to be an incentive for educating people to that extent unless those changes are already made. Democracy was kind of a leap of faith in a lot of respects, we went ahead and sort of flew in the face of a tremendous amount of philosophical discourse suggesting that the average peasantry wasn't capable of or intelligent enough to make any decisions. And of course, the aristocracy were the only ones capable of voting back in the day, 1786 or whatever. But there are always these difficult leaps and bounds. I am willing to test and to theorize to a point, but democracy is to me non-negotiable. We test until we cannot, and when we cannot anymore, we simply act. And that's a risk I think is worth taking, because I think the consequences of, in this case, fastidiousness could be, decades or perhaps centuries more of, interminable bourgeois control.
Mm-hmm. So just a big clarifying statement. Democracy is non-negotiable. You kind of don't agree with that, right? Not in every instance. Maybe within the workplace
cool
and the proper legal structure. It does feel very cool saying it, I'm sure. But we agreed previously, right, that democracy is a non-negotiable in every facet of society. There are a great many facets where, okay, democracy is very it's very negotiable
right.
here.
In a consequentialist sense, of course, everything is negotiable as long as you could, as long as the negotiation could potentially lead to better outcomes. I have a strong ideological bias towards the benefits of democracy. I think most people in the modern world do. They just only apply it to political democracy instead of economic democracy. But it should be noted, of course, the jump to political democracy that we engaged in was not driven by some sort of data-oriented observational understanding that it would lead to better outcomes. It was an ideological leap driven by philosophy and philosophical texts, not by sociologists of the Enlightenment going, well, there's we've done the numbers and this makes it this much more likely to, that's not to say the research is bad, only that, these great political paradigm shifts are often brought about not, there's a degree of faith leaping, I think, in some cases that I think has to be accepted lest we wallow.
Yeah, okay. I agree with what you mean there, what you say there. So okay, so that's the first one then. We both agree that right now with the research we have on work cooperatives, there is a significant amount of selection bias that makes it like it can't just be extrapolated onto, okay, well, the same thing will happen if we do mandates. That's excellent. Onto the second thing I was going to mention here. So the second one has to do with wage hierarchy. So as I'm sure we all know, in worker cooperatives, the wage pyramid is a lot more compressed compared to traditional firms, meaning that the most paid person isn't going to be earning as much compared to the lowest paid person in a worker co-op as compared to a traditional firm. From the research we have on this, we can see that by virtue of this more flat wage hierarchy existing, we often see people with, a lot of expertise, a lot of experience, a lot of education more than anything, having higher hazard rates, so rates of leaving the firm as compared to regular workers, because that individual person who has a really good education, has a lot of credentials and qualifications, they can obtain more, revenue and more well-being for themselves, get a higher wage if they choose to work for a traditional firm that has a more sharp and, vertical wage pyramid than a cooperative does. As such, you can kind of infer a lot of issues that comes with worker cooperatives' abilities to, attract highly educated people, because they tend to leave because they're able to accomplish a higher wage for themselves in more traditional firms. And because of this, some degree of brain drain seems to be a phenomena that will occur in worker cooperatives, especially when there are traditional firms that that person could work at instead.
Of course. This is why we have to destroy them. Um, there's always going to be a seepage of resources from equitable democratic institutions to inequitable ones, as long as the inequitable ones are allowed to exist. I suppose the comparison to this would be if you had the United States split evenly, between a place where democracy ruled and a place where you could be a warlord if you wanted, and warlords had the ability to offer ridiculous benefits to people who would come be their right-hand men, something you couldn't possibly give them in a fair democratic society. Or to use a less ridiculous example, we can talk about slavery, where slavery was legal in the southern states, and as a product of that, there was a massive economic incentive for them to continue that system, because the comparatively equitable system they had in the north without slavery was not as economically efficient if you're already the slave owner. Or I guess to make the comparison here, if you're a person with resources or with technical expertise worthy of being fought over by different firms. It's at the end of the day, predatory institutions will always be able to prey, which is why they need to be eliminated. In terms of how this would function within a worker cooperative society, when there is no such external competition to deal with, as long as we live in a market economy, which market socialism tragically is, the whole competitive wages to bring in talent thing is going to continue to be an issue. I'd be interested in seeing if having some kind of federal mandate of a maximum ratio between like the highest and the lowest paid worker would be possible, if there was like a 1-to-8 like hard gap where the person at top could never make 8 times or more than 8 times more than the person paid the least. And if there was a way to get around that with contract labor, because then maybe you could have people like sniping the best talent, but in order for them to do that, they'd have to offer wages which would require them to pay their lowest paid people quite a lot, which would be pretty cool. The only thing I'll add to that, though, is that I do feel like the shiftlessness that we see with people's jobs right now is something fairly unique to the modern era for a number of reasons. Not just because of globalization and the fact that everyone can work online these days if you're not in the service economy, but also because there's very little job loyalty. I think worker cooperatives tend to have much more job loyalty for a number of, pretty straightforward reasons. People tend to be much more invested in their businesses, and I feel like, I'd be interested in seeing how this plays out, but I feel like people working at worker cooperatives would be less competitively minded when it came to some elements of their job because they grow connected to their workplace in the way many people are willing to take technical economic trade-offs for personal comfort in other elements of their life, such as the routes they take to travel, or the house that they live in, the neighborhood they live in. Like, people will make suboptimal economic decisions if it means more personal happiness. So I think I'd be interested seeing how that plays out when workplaces are a little more humanizing.
Yeah, so a few things on that. So I would say that, okay, I understand what you're saying. However, I think there's one issue with the prescription of, okay, that's why you make them illegal and you have like all of the firms are co-ops, therefore people can't go to the other ones. Is that this is
Inshallah.
especially true for highly educated, very educated people, okay, who have a lot of money. They will just move to another country where they can work at a traditional firm and make a lot of money there instead. So unless you have like a big global like of basically like a global co-op revolution, so to say, where you do co-ops pretty much across the entirety of the economies of the world, it's very likely that somebody might be educated in the United States under where co-ops are mandated, and then they might move to, I don't know, Europe, let's say, where they may not have all the worker co-ops mandated, and there they will work at a traditional firm, and there they will make a lot more money. So unless something happens globally, there will always be an option, especially for these very, wealthy, well-educated people, to just move and, be able to achieve that elsewhere.
It's a possibility. I don't know how much of a problem capital flight really is, but normally when we talk about capital flight, we're talking about, like very wealthy people who are trying to like make money off the margins. In terms of very talented people, we see the reverse of this because there are doctors in like, India or whatever who will move to the US because of course we can pay them much more there. But I
Mm-hmm.
wonder how much that would be accounted for if they could have had a good life in India. Because like it is true, for example, doctors in America make quite a bit more than doctors do in Finland because we have, a much more predatory private healthcare scheme. But I don't think there's a big thing of like European social democracies having their like top laborers move to the US for better wages. They're fine over there even for lower wages relatively because they like their countries and there are provisions over there that they enjoy and they like being with their family and stuff. So I feel like and obviously like there's going to be an element of this still being an issue because we're always talking about percentages and averages, but I feel like as long as people here are doing well, they won't be drawn towards, at least not in great numbers, um potentially higher paying jobs elsewhere. Or at the very least, if they are, I think there would be just as many people who would be more interested in the thing that we have going on over here than the whatever systems they have present there. Especially because there are a lot of very very technically proficient people who could potentially make high wages who don't. Right? There are lots of people who have the skill sets of a high paid computer engineer or the skill sets of a like a well paid doctor or a lawyer or a bunch of other things, but they don't have the pay of those groups because when reality when we talk about the people in those groups who are very well compensated, we're talking about a minority. The average doctor doesn't make 350,000 a year. The average lawyer doesn't make 500,000 a year. So
Mm-hmm.
maybe we're skimming off the top here. Maybe we're talking about not just the chance of a group leaving, but the fraction of a chance of a margin of a group leaving. This is one of those I'd need more data to see things, but I feel
Mm-hmm.
like it could be managed.
Yeah, it could be, but it can also be very. So I'm going to say a few things about what you said. So, for example, you talked about Finland as an example. I think that it generally serves your point. Although more broadly, generally, you will still have the creme de la creme of doctors being in the U.S., but that doesn't mean that Finland lacks competent doctors or whatever. So there is that. But then we have examples of that where brain drain is still manageable and it still functions well. But then on the other hand, we have other examples where it's a lot more significant, it's a lot more harmful. So, for instance, if we talk about countries like Venezuela or of more, like poorer countries in the European Union, like for instance, Romania, you will see that a lot of the people who end up getting, or Greece as well, a lot of people who end up getting educated, they will move, and it is a significant economic issue for those countries from where they move away from. Now obviously like remittances can help alleviate that a little bit, but nevertheless it's still a significant thing. And the question then is, hey, if we were to do a mandate of worker cooperatives, how bad would the brain drain be? Would it be Venezuela, Romania, Greece bad, or would it be Finland bad? And once again, we don't know. We don't have the data to be able to show it, and there is a lot of potential for something pretty bad to happen there, and there to be brain drain that is significant enough where you end up seeing pretty bad outcomes in your domestic economy as a result of this mandate. So once again, this is another place where you can make a theoretical argument for, hey, here is something that is potentially could happen, and that isn't like a really far reach or whatever, but we don't know. We have no idea right
Possibly,
now. So.
though I think the United States is closer to Finland than we are to Greece or vuvuzela, right? I mean, the reason people fled those countries is because they suffered severe economic catastrophes that were led their economy incapable of providing a good life for people of any economic quintile, not just
Mhm.
experts. Experts were just the ones who tended to have the money to flee. There were plenty of other types who wanted to flee Greece during their crisis, or Venezuela currently. They just didn't have the money to book a plane flight, right?
Mhm.
I'm willing to bet that that's more a product of massive global economic disparity than it would be just the potential problems of brain drain altogether. Of course, if America had a functioning social democracy, we would be, I think, a pretty nice country to live in.
Mhm.
All things considered, I think people would be willing to stick around for it.
Yeah, it's possible. It could go anyway, really. But then I can also understand how, like, hey, if we're gonna use the things like you talked about before, like what was it? Did you throw around the name number like up to 8 times, or is that something I've read somewhere? I'm not sure, but I think that the discrepancies between, like, hey, this country you can only earn 8 times as much as the bottom earner, whereas in this country you can earn up to, like, 200, 100 times as much, and that's like a pretty that's like a massive discrepancy. But once again, it's hard to say. It's basically it's impossible to say right now exactly how it will
I did.
pan out.
I threw out
And I think
eight.
I think you can make arguments that it could go.
Yeah, I threw out
You
8
know.
just as an example. I think that's what
Mhm.
Mondragon used to have. 8 times, I think. Although I think they butchered that,
Mhm.
or it got expanded, or they just have so much
That's
contract
within
labor.
one firm as part of the federation, not within the federation as a
Right,
whole.
right, right. Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of Mondragon personally. But yeah, I just threw that out there. 8 times
Mhm.
is maybe a bit on the lower end. It could be, I suppose, 10, 12, 16. The income disparity is not the greatest ill to me. When we're
Mhm.
talking about retaining labor in a market economy, as much as it pains me as a socialist to talk about this at all, comparative wage differences aren't so much, or at least shouldn't be so much, about the quality of the life you live as
Mhm.
the luxuries that you can afford as an additional incentive to secure long-term labor in a position of great import. Right now, CEOs are paid a lot because their loyalty is what's being paid for, not really
Mhm.
managerial competence. It's subservience to the board of directors primarily, I
Mhm.
think, and ideally, in a worker cooperative system, because there would be no such financiers above. The only reason that any firm would vote on a wage disparity of any kind would be because they recognize that doing so might allow them to retain higher quality labor. But I feel like that system could be accounted for in a less cynical manner if it was something that people voted on themselves. At the end of the day, a
Mhm.
firm that is cooperatively owned and managed will always have a person at the top, whether they're paid the same amount or 8 times as much. The question
Mhm.
is, would increasing the wage at the top allow them to attract people with more managerial experience? And I think that's a decision they would be able to make as competently as any shareholder board does today.
Yeah, maybe, and then just like because we're both kind of like throwing out but like theoretical arguments for both sides, then I could also potentially mention that, hey, this research that exists right now about the higher hazard rate for like like well-educated and highly skilled workers. I mean, we can see that right now they choose to forego a lot of the potential positives that come with a worker cooperative, such as the maybe the increased productivity or the increased overall happiness of being at the specific workplace, the greater, better tied communities, the potentials for economic resilience in downturns, how they are willing to kind of throw that out in order to obtain a higher wage in a traditional firm within still the United States of America. So I mean, yeah, there is there is examples and there is like theoretical arguments that can be made for,
Though
like, okay, well, this
the
is it likely that this might happen? Is it likely that this might happen?
It is a skewed deck, of course, because we're talking
Mhm.
about private ownership, which is an institutional behemoth that's been funded and promoted politically for 2.5 centuries, versus
Mhm.
worker cooperatives, which has at best always been a marginal alternative about which people have fairly low levels of information, and there also isn't much saturation of worker cooperatives in a number of industries.
Mhm.
There just aren't that many of them. So a lot of it could be like an availability thing. Also, a lot of people only look for wages when they search for jobs because the wages are the only thing that they're taught to look for.
Mhm.
There are cultural metrics that we don't value. that we used to value just 60 or 70 years ago. Loyalty to a business used to be a big thing that people cared about. Like when everyone was a factory worker that made like 3 times minimum wage an hour with like a high school, education.
Uh-huh.
The idea of being loyal to your business so that you could get promoted from within and then retire at 68 after being a factory manager for 30 years, that was a cultural value that people had, which was tied to market economics through autocratic ownership that no longer exists today because of the gig economy. People don't look for that because it doesn't exist, which is an indication, I think, that, people's values, people's incentives, and what they look for in a business, in a job, these do shift over time, even within the system we have right now. So, I think greater shifts are possible with a deliberate, educational programs.
Okay. Um, yeah, I think I agree with most of that, especially about the company culture thing. I think we have really, really, really toxic company culture and workplace culture right now, and I think that there's a lot of aspects of that that should absolutely be changed, and that might change the hand that we're playing with right now when we're discussing these things. So then, I guess to summarize this argument, would you agree with me still though that we aren't sure exactly, and that there is a potential for brain drain to be an issue if we just mandate everything, or do you believe that that's just not going to happen at all, or like how's your open-mindedness towards that at the moment?
I think it's certainly something that could be an issue. I think it's
Hmm.
something that could be heavily mitigated, and there's good circumstantial evidence to indicate that it's either not going to be a severe problem or it's a problem that could be managed. But it is certainly something which would need to be taken into account, because obviously the consequences of not taking into account could be bad.
Okay, excellent. All right, so that was number two, and then I think we can just get through. I was going to have this one at the end, but yeah, I don't think this one will take very long at all. So obviously, we see kind of mixed results when it comes to worker co-ops. So they will perform really, really well and do really good stuff in certain sectors, while in others they're kind of whatever, and they have very, very kind of like more mixed results, maybe sometimes even worse results than what traditional firms are. It varies greatly depending on the industry, and therefore maybe like an entire like worker co-op mandate could really adversely affect certain sectors of the economy relative to the other ones. This is, I assume, something we agree on, right?
Of course, we would need to do more research, and if there are industries
Mhm.
that are just not amenable to worker control, and of course there are many types of worker control, right? Obviously, the easiest one would be just a flat cooperative, but anything past 20 people, and that gets pretty difficult. You can have like different levels of this block of workers votes in their manager, and then these 10 managers from these 10 regions vote in the head manager, and so on. But
Mhm.
there are many ways things could be handled. But if for some reason we arrived at the conclusion that, internal democratic structures were not efficiently capable of managing the needs of a given industry, then I would look towards other systems, such as nationalization, or well, I suppose there are many ways to cow the bourgeois, outside of internal democracy. That's just my preferred system.
Okay. Yep. Yeah, excellent. I didn't expect there to be a lot of disagreement on this. And then finally, the fourth kind of like theoretical argument we have potentially that could be harmful in a mandate is when it comes to issues in relation to innovation, and most specifically the monetary and capital investments that would go into certain degrees of innovation and experimental practices.
Mhm.
So this stems primarily in what is the goal? What is the main purpose of a co-op compared to a traditional firm? Traditional firm, profit motive. We want to make as much money as possible for our shareholders. That's the purpose of that's a traditional firm. Now, while making money for the shareholders, which would be the workers, is definitely one incentive and one goal in worker cooperatives. It's a lot more broad than that, and there is more elements of like caring about the local community, ensuring things like job safety, job security, good conditions, and having it be a more like community-oriented thing that the firm operates insofar as it benefits the financial security and well-being of the workers. And in that situation, we see that the incentive structures, while there are a great many harms and a great many perverse incentives that come with the profit motive, at times there can be potential innovations and potential opportunities for growth by trying, for instance, experimental practices that somebody with the profit with the motive of, hey, I'm going to make as much money as possible as a shareholder. We're going to put a bunch of money into this and risk it, and maybe this will like multiply 10 times in value after the investments were done. Whereas a worker cooperative could be like, hey, we're doing pretty well right now. Everyone within this community of workers that we have, we're chilling. We're happy with how it works right now. We may not want to, we don't have that same drive towards expansion and making a bunch more profit, because we may not want to risk the great quality of life, financial security, job security that we have right now as a collective, as a group of workers, by making these kind of trying these more experimental practices and taking these additional risks. So insofar as that's the case, I can see that there being some forms of like downward pressures on the likelihood to engage in some more like experimental business practices, or making like very heavy investments into potential innovations in a worker cooperative as compared to a traditional firm.
I suppose my retort to that would be that there is no group more complacent and comfortable than shareholders. Sitting on their piles of money. I don't think corporations are particularly inclined towards risk. I think there are types of institutions that need these big gambles in order to function properly. The obvious example would be the pharmaceutical industry. The pharmaceutical industry invests billions of dollars into research and development on their drugs. There's no way to have a pharmaceutical industry that doesn't do that, right? I imagine that if a pharmaceutical industry was cooperatively owned, it would have to continue doing so, because the potential, if nothing else, the potential business rewards of engaging in that kind of speculative research, in that research and development, would prioritize in I guess the free market any worker cooperative that continued to do so. Any pharmaceutical industry that didn't do so would quickly fall to the wayside. I suppose the implication here is that, workers would just settle for what's comfortable. But if there's an industry that needs research and development, there will be people whose job it is to do research and development. And a comfortable pharmaceutical technician is a person who's doing research and development. It's their job to, right? Like comfort for a person who does that work isn't just not doing anything. It's continuing to do their work with good pay, with good benefits, with control over their workplace and their hours. And oftentimes, the only reason private companies even do any of this is because of government refunds, subsidies, or grants. I feel like there are ways to draw this process out into a cooperative one. I don't necessarily know if a worker cooperative would be less inclined towards risk-taking or investment with R&D oriented stuff, but even if they were, I think a lot of this stuff could probably benefit from being handed to the government anyway. Most of the really sick research we get is done through public institutions and grants, from laboratories, built into the basements of universities that get their federal grants, that pull from federal tax budgets to I mean, that's how mRNA research came about. Usually corporations, because they're profit motive oriented, are the ones who pick up on that research and then take advantage of existing grant and subsidy programs to extrapolate it into commercially viable products, which is a service I think cooperatives are perfectly capable of doing. If anything, we can improve on that, because I feel like much more needs to be done with the actual technological development side of things, and a little bit less needs to be done with the ways of commercializing existing technological development side of things. Obviously, both can exist in tandem. They're not mutually exclusive, but I think, to summarize, I'm sorry, the issues we have with research are ones which I don't think would be exacerbated with worker cooperatives, and I think could potentially even be improved by a more collectivistic attitude towards the way in which we fund and prioritize our research goals.
Yeah. So to clarify one thing here, I see some things in chat. Maybe there is a misunderstanding. So I am by no means saying that the profit motive is the only or the superior or the exclusive whatever motive towards driving innovation and new like heavy research and development and all of that. That is not the case. However, what I do want to recognize, Vaush, I see you in chat. What the fuck are you saying? Say it out loud. Don't write it in the chat.
Pogo, looking at chat, always a bad move. You know goddamn well my chat's going to get angry at anyone I'm talking to, no matter what they say or what I say.
Yeah, I understand, and I see some other times where I wanted to respond as well, but I didn't.
You never do it. You never ever look. It's always something. The temptation to look to say something is overwhelming. No matter how reasonable anyone's being, it's always a goddamn shit show.
Yeah, but the reason I'm doing it now is because I can genuinely understand this might be a misunderstanding. Well, before with some other stuff I was seeing said, I was like, okay, just shut the fuck up. I don't care what you said. But anyway, yeah, but there is it's by no means the only thing. But I do recognize that hey, in some capacities, the profit motive does serve in certain instances towards bringing about innovations. And I think we can even look at this from a more like anti big business, anti big corporations, anti big hedge funds and shareholders perspective as well. And I think a lot of people would agree with it if it was just phrased in the other way. So, for instance, like we talk about this a lot, and this is kind of like a common thing where people make critiques about the volatility of a stock market and job security and stuff like that. How you will see, very big capital owners and people who hold a lot of capital, so that's the exact same thing. I don't know why I said that twice. What they might end up doing is they might end up, through their controlling shares or through their voting shares in a given firm, being like, okay, hey, with this company, we're going to try some extraordinarily risky shit. We're going to put a lot of money into this. And we'll see, maybe it'll be really good. And if it fails, well, I guess fuck that company, fuck everyone that works there. I mean, they're kind of out of luck, but I have enough money. It was fine. It was a risk, worth taking for me as a big capital holder, as a big person, who is able to like take that loss should it not go, but still think it's worthwhile to invest in it in case it makes a lot of money. And we obviously recognize the massive destructive effects that has on firms. How a lot of firms and a lot of practices use experimental. If it fails, then the average worker is hurt a lot because that company has to it goes out of business then basically because they tried investing into something experimental that ended up being a flop or whatever. And that's obviously bad. We should have great social security nets in order to catch people who are hurt by those behaviors. But, I'm not going to say fairly often, but there occurs instances where that practice is done, and then we end up getting something really good out of that. We end up getting a new business practice. We end up getting a new product. We end up getting a new practice that ends up being very, very beneficial for economic growth and for innovation. So that's the kind of perspective I'm coming at this from. I do think that if we have the profit motive still as an incentive that we have kind of like on its own within a company, and assuming we have a good enough social security net, we don't have to get rid of it entirely as a potential source for innovation and for research and development. Which would kind of happen quite a bit. It would be curtailed significantly if we went to a purely cooperative economy, because the government can do a bit, but I think that we should have as many potential incentives for innovation and research and development as we can, and try to minimize the negatives and improve the positives instead of cutting some out entirely.
The only incentive that we have for research and development that exists in an autocratic firm as opposed to a democratic one is the greed of the shareholders, which can be a kick in the ass sometimes, sure, but there are plenty of ways in which that can be a toxic incentive. Greed, for example, can prevent risk-taking. It can also incentivize them to focus only on high-return commercial projects with low risk, rather than projects which have the potential to more substantially, impact the research world. Additionally, a system in which the researchers themselves have more control would be one I would be more comfortable with, because from what I've read on R&D, at least in pharmaceutical tech, it seems like pretty often the real brains of the organization, the research technicians, the people who are ungodly smart, they don't have that much control over what they do. They do their research and they're given directions by people with business degrees, but that's a pretty inefficient allocation of, resources to have their work being guided by people with absolutely no, or at least minimal expertise in their field. I think there are ways in which giving more control to them could itself be a positive incentive, because they might be more capable of determining which research avenues would be preferential. Right now, the only research that's really pursued in any of these private firms are ones which they think can turn a profit later, which means, accepting situations like the COVID vaccine where you have the government stepping in to ensure that it's free, which is a pretty unique exception. For the most part, these innovations are going to come out for the wealthy only. What is the pharmaceutical industry working on right now? Is it cancer, prevention? Is it a cure for cancer? Is it Alzheimer's vaccines? Is it immortality? The answer is all of them, and all of them are going to cost $1 billion when they come out. So that is the consequence of profit greed-oriented research and development. But I think it's possible that you could procure fewer toxic incentives and more beneficial ones from letting the people who know the research actually work in it. A lot of these people, I think, have pretty altruistic attitudes towards the stuff they do. Nobody gets into pharmaceutical tech because they're dreaming of making a stockholder rich one day, right? I mean, they want to make the medicine. That's, what they care about.
Mhm.
We could see how that plays out. Also, even if there was a deficiency in proper incentives, I feel like you could compensate for that in the same way we need to right now with private institutions, which is with proper federal guidance. What do they subsidize? What do they provide grants for? If we needed that
Mhm.
incentive for private firms, then I mean, there's no reason why we wouldn't for cooperatively owned ones.
Okay, yeah, so I agree with a lot of what you said there. So there are absolutely instances in which the profit motive and very, very large shareholders can engage in behaviors that is non-conducive to innovation and further growth. So, for instance, rent-seeking behaviors, just like the massive word that we can use to describe a lot of the issues that we're pointing out when it comes to big shareholders not using their capital for innovation and just using it there. So it's sitting kind of accumulating wealth, but in no ways that will like change the paradigm of any given economic field or sector or anything of the sort. I agree with that, and I also agree that to a great capacity, giving more autonomy to researchers when it comes to determining the research directions, rather than a lot of it being just kind of like where the capital is, can absolutely be very valuable in encouraging more research in areas that may be neglected because of the lack of capital, because of the lack of profit that may be in those industries at the moment under a capitalist economy. I agree with that 100%. But at the same time, there's one question that I have for you. Do you believe that there are any instances, or that there are, yeah, that there are any instances in which the profit motive can serve as like a valuable tool towards pushing for innovation, or do you think it's just like pretty much categorically always going to be inferior to other sources?
Well, I think the profit motive is still present in a cooperative firm as long as it's still a market economy, no? Obviously, it's a sort of collectively determined profit motive as
Profit motive.
opposed to one
Mhm.
exclusively for the benefit of the shareholders. But so between those two, I don't believe there's necessarily any incentive which prioritizes the former over the latter. I don't know if there's necessarily a benefit. I can think of some
Wait, so just to be clear,
downsides.
I'm not asking you between the two, which one you think is better. I'm asking you whether or not you think that the profit one, if it has
Oh,
value,
at all.
if it.
The profit motive is essential with how we have things set up right now. Sure, it'd be
Mhm.
nice to get rid of it. Don't get me wrong. This is all phase one, but
Mhm.
insofar as a system which is oriented as I've described it, the profit motive is the necessary underpinning mechanism for, uh, a ton of economic functionality. Obviously,
Mhm.
the goal would be to replace it with other systems of incentives, but
Mhm.
I think that you need to. I think it's important to work on the class divide issue, that schism, before you can begin to address any global economic paradigms, because I think that that involves way more transformative work. In the meantime, the best we can do is mitigate the profit motive's worst externalities. Um,
In
and
the meantime,
yeah,
is that meantime right now, or is that meantime like worker cooperative society?
no, right now, up until the
That's right now.
abolition
Okay.
of the profit motive, up until the abolition of the commodity form,
Okay.
we have to
Wait, hold
mitigate its
on. Like
negative
abolition of the
externalities.
commodity form, that's not done under worker cooperatives, to my knowledge, right?
That would have to be next. You would
That
secure
would
the
have to be
worker
okay.
cooperatives, and then after that, you would achieve you would have a proletarian state in that situation,
Mhm.
and then ideally you could, leverage that global economic power in order to eliminate the commodity form entirely and achieve a classless
Mhm.
society. I mean, that's the that's the hope.
Okay.
We're John Maddening it. We've got the game plan. We'll see how it plays out.
Yeah. Okay. I guess I have a different perspective. So the way I view this is that like, hey, we should have as many potential incentives for research and development, for trying new things, and for potential like having investments and new innovations that we can in an economy. I do recognize that there are a lot of negative externalities that often come with the profit motive, and I think that the best solution to that is not necessarily to get rid of the kind of the conventional firm profit motive, is what I'm saying. Because the profit motive exists in the worker cooperatives, but a worker cooperative profit motive and a traditional firm profit motive are fairly different. I mean, you said as much yourself. I do see that that conventional firm profit motive does have significant negatives and can have worse outcomes. But I also believe that just that ability, the rather like absurd amount of capital that can move around and can be pushed towards things that are very, very heavily in economic demand, and the amount of benefit that can come for that is pretty positive. So where I'm at right now is I feel that like, hey, the best thing for us to do is to keep as many sources of incentive for innovation as possible while trying our very, very best to reform out as many of the negative externalities of, conventional firm profit motive incentives, for instance, rather than getting rid of it entirely. That's where I'm at
Of
with
course.
that at the
We
moment. And I think that this, yeah, sorry.
Oh no, just we manage what we can when we can. Right now, obviously, we don't have a proletarian state, so the best we can hope for is education, advocacy, and regulation. But
Mm-hmm.
when more power is achieved, you can go for more bold reforms. In either case, whether we have a system which is cooperative or autocratic economically, the profit motive contains within it many negative externalities that will require severe regulation in order for things to be kept on board. Worker cooperatives and market socialism do not fix, for example, pollution. They don't fix, people dumping waste, like chemical wastewater into rivers. They don't fix, a great many of improper incentive structures. So it's a balancing act with that effect. It solves some problems, but not all.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll do what we can when the time comes.
Okay. So out of the four arguments I made, the stifling innovation argument, this one, you don't find this one, this would be like the least plausible or convincing argument, I guess, to you out of the four I laid out, right?
I
I would,
think that
from that's kind of the vibe I'm getting.
I think worker cooperatives in systems which encourage research and development would equal traditionally owned firms. I don't know if there would be any exceeding. If there would
Mhm.
be, it would be because of the added efficiency of giving greater control to the people actually conducting the research rather than the business people who direct them. But that would very much be a wait and see type dealio for me.
Okay. All right. Excellent. And now, with those four arguments done, now we're going to get to the conclusion, the climax of this conversation. So, we both recognize that there exists a series of potential, or there exists a series of theoretical arguments for why a cooperative mandate can lead to pretty significant negative outcomes, and we don't know exactly how that will be and how harmful it be, if it will be harmful at all. But we acknowledge that there's a risk without having the research and the data on hand to be able to, responsibly advocate for those things. So I ask you then, if your principal concern and if the principal way by which you evaluate whether or not something is good is based on outcomes, why do you orient so much, and why do you advocate for a worker cooperative mandate when there are so many potential outcomes that are a question mark, where there can be very, very significant negative outcomes that arise as a result of all the things that we talked about here today?
Well, I advocate towards the steps towards them because I do think more research needs to be done with some elements of worker cooperative management and their, being mandated and what have you. But I have a very strong, I'm an ideologue. I have an ideological bias towards democracy. It's something for which I am willing to make sacrifices and something for which I am willing to take leaps of faith. So in my case, obviously you can never account for every possible externality or consequence of a major paradigm shift. Policies are enacted all the time upon which we have reasonable amounts of information, but not complete amounts. Sometimes policies are failures, but an effort is made anyway.
Mm-hmm.
One of the greatest experiments we ever engaged in was the experiment of democracy, because prior to the general popularity of democratic societies, the predominant belief was that the peasantry were not intelligent enough to effectively manage their own country or their own kingdom, that they were slovenly, sort of stupid, maybe good-hearted, but the affairs of state were something which should be left to scholars, political scientists, aristocrats, and the nobility. And that was the predominant line of thinking, or equivalents of it, for essentially all of human history, with minor exceptions, until, broadly, the idea of political democracy was popularized. And it was, of course, a leap of faith, and there were problems with it. And there were also, by the way, undeniable downsides to democracy. Democratic societies are slow. They tend to be more vulnerable to certain types of political action, both from within and from without. It's difficult for them to make great national plans that may be necessary. We can't do a 5-year plan here in the United States, even though there are plenty of things I would love to do 5-year plans for, because, first of all, a presidential term is 4 years, and once a person gets elected into office, all the old plans go kaput. And second of all, the government can't agree to do anything. Even if the government could agree to do anything, the state governments have their own issues and blah, 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 blah. Whereas an autocracy, as China has demonstrated, is capable of spending vast amounts of money to essentially future-proof their design. Now, China is making plenty of mistakes in the process of doing that, but gods, looking at what China's been able to do, sometimes you have to look at that and think like, oh my God, I'm in favor of democracy, but if you could just snap your fingers and just expend like $500 million doing this thing without having to worry about all of the, the legal problems the government of America would run into, like that would undeniably be more efficient. It would be. You can't argue that. Maybe there's more national cohesion in authoritarian societies because their educational systems don't allow for dissenting thought. Now, that's an inefficiency depending on how you look at things. I like free thought. It's another ideological bias of mine. But the point that I'm getting at is that a lot of these are going to come down to value statements and preferences over an explicit data-oriented advocacy for the superiority of one system over another. It could well be the case that you could find that people were happier under authoritarian societies than they were under democratic societies. You could somehow find that data. I would still say that I would rather live in a democratic society, because human happiness at the end of the day, while a tremendously nice thing, isn't the only thing I politically prioritize. There are other things I need to take into consideration. But
overall, you would still say though that the reason why you like democracy is because overall you deem the outcomes of a democracy to be more desirable than the outcomes of other forms of government, like authoritarianism, right?
Yeah, but my outcomes can't be charted. Human happiness, GDP, these are good indicators, more happiness than GDP at the very least, but they're not perfect. Unhappy people in a free society are, to me, living more authentically, in, I guess, an existentialist sense, than happy people living in an unfree society, A person who never knows unhappiness because every moment of their life is dictated to them by a superior officer, that to me is a person living less authentically than someone who makes choices and is miserable as a product of them. I value that freedom, not just because of what it means for any individual, because broadly, the fact that we are free means we have the ability to insulate ourselves against future changes to the authority structures that would have otherwise mandated our happiness. And also, it means we have control over our own happiness, and that autonomy is something I consider really important. But I could never chart any of these. I could never, I could, like, if an authoritarian was asking me in this world where authoritarianism makes people happier, which it doesn't, by the way, but if it did, in that world, like, they're asking me, well, why do you prefer democracy? Look at these numbers. The only answer that I would have is to say that my value system is different from theirs, and then I guess I would arm wrestle them or something. It's not something that I could meaningfully chart out in data. Charting out the data is important to me because I think there are better ways to implement the abolition of the bourgeois than others. I think that doing so the most efficient way possible is ideal, because that improves the outcomes, right? But, even if everything all told stayed at par, or possibly even the economy got a little bit worse, it's still something I'd have to fight for.
Okay, so then I guess I just have a fairly simple question here. So, would you prefer a society that is like worker cooperative mandated and that is a worker democracy, who's like where the economic productivity is like way lower, and as a result of that, people have a worse quality of life, considerably and significantly when it comes to a wide range of outcomes? I wish I could have like a model so we could perfectly like conceptualize this, or like an ideal example, but I can't think of one off the top of my head, as compared to a country that doesn't have it but has pretty good outcomes when it comes to those departments, like, for example, a lot of the Nordic countries we have right now. Would you prefer the former there to the latter?
I guess it would depend on the severity of the difference, but I feel like we've sort of already answered this question, haven't we? Because there are a million stories that we've written where the happy protagonists live in a ragtag and technologically and economically deficient society, contrasted against the rampant economic superiority of an autocratic society. It's one of the great framings that, that we became politically fixated on after the Great Enlightenment, right? The idea that there are things preferable simply to living in societies with great economic or technological outcomes. The dystopian future where everyone has access to anything they could ever want, but everything is done at the boot and heel of an authoritarian, as opposed to a society in which people live in dirt villages but are free. You know, I'll say this
Mhm.
much, okay? Getting wealthier has not made Americans any happier. All the data in the world suggests otherwise, in fact, that happiness is derivative not of a strong economy or of access to technology, rather of other adjacent relations. Of course,
Yeah, community,
yeah.
family, mental health, all those things. Yeah.
Now, a good economy, of course, is still important because you don't want people
Mhm.
like starving. That obviously negatively affects, but in a happy medium, it seems like a lot of the technological and economic incentives that we care about, a lot of the developments that we care about, are sort of window dressing, and we haven't
Mhm.
fixed some of the fundamental things. Alienation from the workplace in a Marxian sense is one of the great things that brings about human unhappiness. The feeling that you're not a part of your community, that there's no relationship between you and the place that you work, that the work you do is part of some meaningless, disconnected corporate autocracy upon which you have no control and no outcomes of any meaningful worth are produced. I think this makes people miserable, and I guess how much lower the GDP per capita would have to be before trading that off for genuine workplace fulfillment would be desirable. I don't have a numerical answer, but I think it's worth serious trade-offs. Thankfully, I don't think it'll require serious trade-offs, but I think it's worth them. The only adjacent consideration would be, of course, America doesn't exist in a vacuum. If America was made economically and technologically weak, there would be consequences geopolitically that could lead to other negative externalities, and those would have to be factored in. So the more complicated the considerations get, the more nuanced my answer has to be. But the broad answer is that sacrifices are worth making in the pursuit of this goal.
Yeah, so I'm gonna reel you in a little bit and take you to the question I asked in the beginning, which you answered, like in the beginning of your reply there, which is that you said that it would depend on the severity of the difference that occurs there, and I would agree, and I think that's the reasonable position to be to hold there. So in this entire conversation, we have agreed on a number of different potential negative economic outcomes that could occur from a worker cooperative mandate, and that should they end up playing out as per what the theoretical arguments would suggest, it would lead to significant decreases in quality of life and in economic productivity, and in the difference then when you say a severity of difference. Yet instead of kind of like waiting and being like, hey, so I'm in favor of like experimentation and more, policies are in favor of the advent of more worker cooperatives in society right now in order to gather more data, you very, very repeatedly and you often specifically express support for a mandate, despite not knowing what those outcomes would look like and not being able to really make a good guess because there are such significant shortcomings in the data that we exist in right now.
Mhm.
And that's kind of that's the problem that I have, is that you say this, and I believe you. You say that you value things on the basis of consequences and on the outcomes that they have. Yet you're willing to take this really big gamble when it comes to your advocacy, where the outcomes could be really, really bad, but you still very staunchly like argue in favor for and support something like a worker cooperative mandate.
Of course. I will answer that in just one moment.
Excellent.
Sorry, managing cat behavior. Very
All
bad
right.
cats today. Very bad behavior
Do
from
you
our
do you
group.
democratically manage your cats? Do the cats have
Absolutely
a say,
not.
or is this like an authoritarian?
It's a deeply authoritarian system, but there are
I see.
consequences. Okay, I've got a cut in my nose from Artemy because he bit
Oh
me
wow. Okay.
while purring aggressively. Um, so the reason for this is because if you look throughout history, I describe my advocacy as a philosophical one more than an economic one, or a political one, I could say. Would you go then to any advocate for democracy in the 18th or 17th century and tell them it was irresponsible for them to advocate for it when they had no idea democracy would turn out as good as it did? The issue is, at the end of the day, we make the arguments that we have, motivated by our priorities, our beliefs, our biases. This very, with respect, liberal idea that you can only make passionate advocacies for systems in which you have a full accounting of all possible outcomes, all data which could lead to or be derived from those outcomes. This is not something which is practically manageable with any kind of reasonable paradigm shift. There's no way to account for changes like that if you're talking about anything more substantive than the kind of bill that could be passed through an American legislator. I mean, sure, maybe if you're talking about very simple, retreads of existing policy decisions. Oh, what outcome would there be if we implemented this spending bill for infrastructure, or we gave this tax subsidy, or what have you? Those are easy to chart out. But if you're talking about larger paradigm shifts, especially ones with ideological roots, I don't think there's any way to do so without engaging in rhetoric which is not fully informed by the facts at hand, simply because there's no way to ever be fully informed by the facts at hand. Oftentimes, the only way to understand the totality of these systems is to live within them, to make yourself and your nation a great experiment, as it has been in my nation. There are many things that America not only set out to be an experiment, America prided itself on being an experiment. The great experiment of democracy. When George Washington stepped down from his post as president, Napoleon said him doing so would make him, I believe, the most powerful man on earth. The idea of a person who led a country willfully stepping down to allow another to run was this outlandish, ridiculous, like in the 18th century, but it happened anyway. And that's not to say there haven't been consequences for the process of experimentation, but there are also consequences for fastidiously waiting as we chart out every data point for the potential outcomes of a system that we don't live in yet. You do what you can, but at the end of the day, you have to make a move. Every time we delay, every time we wait, we allow for the internal contradictions of the existing system to continue to mount. Or the example back then, you allow King Henry or whatever to continue to exploit the colonists or whatever. Of course, the American Revolution wasn't really about freedom; it was about tax rights for the founding fathers. But whatever. Sometimes a move simply has to be made. Was it King George? King George, whatever. All English people, all kings, look the same to me. Eventually, a move has to be made, and especially when you're discussing rhetoric. Sometimes, especially for people who want great changes to the world, you can't apply this to everything, though. We don't know what the economic consequences would be of a full federal response to climate change, but it's something we need anyway. Should that one Swedish girl with the pigtails, she goes, we all need to do something now. Well, what now? What would the consequences be of the government spending $500 billion? Greta Thunberg, thank you.
Multilateral trade agreements. That's the answer to it. Anyway.
Of course, naturally, as so far they've worked. Great changes require great steps forward. Oh, do you believe the multilateral trade agreements have sufficiently stopped the advent of climate change?
No, obviously not. We're on the path to climate change, but I think it's our only realistic solution to climate change at this moment in time.
Why realistic solutions? Realistic solutions are why we're in the
pragmatic solution, a solution that will stop it or will stop it as fast as possible.
As fast as possible would be like a global response which reoriented the production of the world's economy towards climate change.
That is actually going to happen, which is that is possible for it to occur.
We choose what can happen, right? Because people didn't think the Civil Rights Act passing was pragmatic in the 60s, nor the formation of America in the 1800s, nor the abolition of slavery. It seems like what's pragmatic is only considered so in retrospect, but at the time the things actually happen, they're not pragmatic. The Russian Revolution took place, they had a failed communist state. That was fun. There are very often, it is these big sporadic movements forward in history. And I think it's good to advocate for these things because you can simultaneously take into account the immediate pragmatically justifiable next step, as I do. We should do advocacy for worker cooperatives. We should research their efficacy in certain issues. We should educate people on them. We should propose better tax policies for them. Simple, manageable stuff like that. But you can frame those alongside the big ideological sweep, which is, we shouldn't just settle for, henpecking at this issue. We should have a federally mandated worker co-op oriented economy. We can do both at the same time. The ideological and the pragmatic must work in tandem, because anyone who operates exclusively in the realm of pragmatism will never achieve anything more than earmarks on a bill that's doomed to fail in the Senate, and anyone who's only concerned with idealism will never get off Twitter. It's only through the synthesis of these two perspectives that you can have people capable of both affecting immediate change and inspiring people towards great, near unpredictable change.
Okay. I really want to pick your brain a bit on the climate change thing. I think there are some things to talk about there, but I want to wrap up the other bit for when it comes to the worker cooperative thing, and then I want to ask you a few questions about that, the climate change take and what we want to do towards that and stuff like that. So number one, you said two things that I want to correct, and then I want to kind of give, I suppose, my conclusion to the conversation. So that you said that it's foolish to wait until we have like a full accounting of what is probably going to happen before we enact a policy or before we do something. I would agree, but there is a lot of distance to cover between where we are right now with research on worker cooperatives compared to where we could be at the point where we could, reasonably and safely and responsibly argue for worker cooperative mandates. I think that kind of saying that, oh, unless you have like literally all of the data, you won't do anything. I think that's a bit, I don't think that's the case. I think there's a lot of distance that we can cover between where we are right now and where we could be before we responsibly advocate for it. Number two, you also kind of said that, okay, well, at this moment, we might just kind of be like waiting, doing nothing because we don't have all the research. Once again, I'm not in favor of doing that either, specifically worker cooperatives as well. I'm in favor of doing a great many things in order to incentivize the creation of worker cooperatives. A lot of them I've listed in the document that I actually presented on your stream, a while back. So things like, for instance, tax incentives, payments for turning a conventional firm into a cooperative, preferential subsidized loans, cooperative educational and training programs, funding of research into worker cooperatives at the university level, government loans for employees willing to buy firms from owners, capital gains cuts for owners selling their firms to employees, preferential purchasing right for employees of a firm facing closure, promotion of unions generally, and fighting against contra cooperatives. And these are all policies that I am advocating for today that I think is beneficial for this issue. So I think that's saying that like waiting and doing nothing. I don't think that's representative of my beliefs on this topic when it comes to work cooperatives and what can be done at the moment. I suppose to conclude this, the main difference between you and I and our rhetoric and our understanding and the way we argue for these topics is that I prefer to only argue for specific policies if I think we have reasonable grounds to stand on when it comes to predicting what the outcomes of that policy is going to be. So I don't need to know 100% for sure this is what happened, but I do want to have a reasonable grounding. And I do not think we have a reasonable empirical grounding right now to argue for a worker cooperative mandate, because I think that the outcomes of that have the potential of being negative to the point where we from a consequentialist perspective, it was a bad idea to do it. Whereas I see you maybe taking a bit more of a belief that like, hey, you believe that there's value specifically in the type of like in the potential maybe like populist or rhetorical and kind of call to action that can be accomplished by pushing for politics and pushing for ideas and pushing for models that may be fairly far into the future, and you see that as a good tool or as a good as a good thing in order to rile support for progressive or socialist or whatever causes. And I guess that's kind of like the difference that we're at right now when it comes to our rhetoric. Do you think that's a fair summary and a fair comparison of our positions, or do you think I'm missing something?
To an extent, but keep in mind that for me, market socialism isn't a policy, it's an entire ideology. To me, a person who suggests that we should promote limited democracy in a society because doing so has been found to be economically productive would be as suspect as a person not supporting democracy at all. I'm concerned at times when people treat worker cooperatives like some fun, extra, cool, spicy alternative to autocratic firms, as though it should just be a little spice added to our broken, economic autocracy. Everything that I say, policy oriented, is just a half measure until the big measure is taken. And big measures are never taken by a policy passed. They're taken through great actions, usually through blood, unfortunately. Past a point, the attitude, towards policy making, everything has to be taken into its account and everything has to be put in its proper place. I think it's possible to advocate for a worker, controlled economy, for a mandate, while also building up the knowledge base necessary to inform how you would go about doing so. In the same way that you and I can say stuff like, and I'm sure you agree with this, I think it would be good if North Korea was democratic. I think it would be good if Iran wasn't a theocracy. Now, of course, the practical methods by which we could accomplish these goals are, to you and I both, unknown. These are complicated problems. I don't have any immediate solutions, but they're things that I can advocate for off an ideological bias. It may well be the case that some methods by which this could be achieved would actually be detrimental. After all, America has brought democracy to a great many places with middling outcomes, so obviously intent and outcome aren't always consequent, but the...
Can I butt in here for 1 second? Is that fine?
Of course.
Yeah. So I would say that when it comes to bringing democracy to really authoritarian and totalitarian countries that exist right now in the world, I would say that we have a sufficient amount of evidence and information to stand on right now to make the argument that that transition will have good outcomes for the people that will be affected by it. That would be my motivation for being in favor of the democratization of these totalitarian and authoritarian nations. I'm getting the impression that there is a bit of like maybe like a deontological almost preference towards certain types of democracy that I'm getting from you. It's a first principle. That's the impression I'm getting.
It's an axiom. I like freedom. I think democracy is the best way of politically approximating it, for now, at least.
So is that axiom democracy or is that axiom freedom, or what specifically is the axiom?
Freedom. Democracy is just the best shot we have at it right now. There are anarchists who talk about post-democratic societies, how democracy is just choosing the person to rule you. At the moment, democracy is our best bet, but who knows what the future holds, right?
Yeah, okay, I see what you mean. So you don't necessarily like freedom insofar as it. Okay, well, I guess it's categorically going to be. So I guess for you, freedom is like categorically a good thing then, yeah?
Yeah, the positive freedom to act upon your will. Obviously, if you're hurting other people, you're infringing upon their freedom. There are caveats to this, of course. Not freedom to go around butchering people, what have you. But yes, essentially freedom. That's why I like democracy and economic democracy alongside. Although I really would prefer democracy just be called political democracy, because when people say political democracy is democracy, they're implying that's the totality of the issue instead of just, a half measure to its totality. But right, that I do that too.
I guess we have a fundamental difference then, because for me, and then maybe I think that's probably why we're butting heads here. Because for me, freedom isn't a fundamental axiom. For me, I only care about freedom insofar as it accomplishes like a wide range of other like good outcomes, human happiness, human well-being, and the rest of those things. So I guess that's probably why there's a bit of a divide in
the issue, of course. In a pragmatic sense, is that without freedom, you can never ensure that the systems which currently perpetuate your well-being won't in the future turn negative. It's one of those, what if you're born under the good king arguments? Well, maybe a dictatorship is beautiful to live in if you're living underneath a wonderfully kind, humanistic dictator, but the next one to be born maybe could be a sociopath. Freedom is a messy system, or a messy, not really a system, thing. It's messy, but I think it's the most reliable way to ensure a kind of balancing mechanism in people's ability to maintain the quality of their own circumstances. People can use freedom to hurt themselves and others, of course, but its absence hasn't been demonstrably shown to lead to good outcomes in a great many circumstances. In the case of North Korea or Iran, maybe it would be better that they're democratic, and I would agree with that, but how to make them democratic? The policies, the principles, that's difficult to understand. Now, to me, the whole federal mandate for worker cooperatives thing, that's a policy proposal, but really what I'm talking about is the elimination of the bourgeoisie. So we could talk about that if you'd prefer. Not a policy, but an ideological goal that I'm not willing to budge from which the federal mandate of worker cooperatives is simply the most immediate, reasonable way of achieving that.
Yeah, I mean, on the abolishing the bourgeoisie thing, for me, and I guess this kind of reflects in maybe the steps that we're willing to take, or that we're kind of gunning for currently. when it comes to solving, class issues that we have generally in society, is that I think that the existence of a bourgeoisie class is bad insofar as the existence of that class is able to perpetuate negative societal things, and your perception is that it necessarily does, and therefore we arrive kind of at the same conclusion, but because our understanding is a bit different there, when it comes to whether or not something is intrinsic and necessarily the case, our prescriptions and what we're willing to push for at the moment is probably gonna differ a bit on those
Of
on
course.
those grounds.
They're different classes with different interests. I mean, it's like eliminating the nobility, right? Of course, we properly eliminated the nobility. When I talk about eliminating the bourgeoisie, I'm just talking about letting them all retire in some nice suburban house. We retired the nobility a lot more aggressively than that. So if anything, they can count their lucky stars that society has advanced since then. But in terms of like the direction society takes, I feel like it's in large part motivated by the power differentials between people who have power and people who experience power. Sorry, damn cat. And the case of the nobility, you can bring the nobility down if you like, right? I mean, you can weaken them, you can Magna Carta them, you can have a House of Lords tempered by a House of Commons, but you don't need the nobility, right? Past a certain point, all you're really doing is perpetuating a bad system by refusing to properly get rid of the old one. It's like keeping the trash bin in. And I think the bourgeois are in a similar position. They don't serve a necessary social function. All labor that's done usefully can be done well by the proletariat. The work the bourgeois do is labor, and labor can be done by laborers, not by people who own the consequences of others' labor.
Mm-hmm.
So they don't serve a necessary social function, or I suppose they do as a cultural icon. I think the bourgeois are as necessary to the functionality of an economy as, the English royalty are to the functionality of their country. It's a nice symbolic flourish, but beyond that, I don't think they're necessary for anything, really.
Okay. I see. Yeah. I guess there's one more. It kind of feels like I'm rehashing a little bit, but I'm gonna ask the question anyway. I don't.
No,
It
not at
wouldn't
all.
take very long to
I enjoy
understand
the
anyway.
conversation. You have nothing to apologize for.
Okay, that's good. So when I asked you the question before, and you said it would depend on the severity of the difference when it comes to which society you would prefer, Sweden or worker cooperative society, but with significantly worse economic well-being, so to say. And you said that which one you prefer would depend on the severity of the difference. Do you believe that there is the possibility that should we mandate worker cooperatives, that that there is negative effects on the economy that are severe enough for you to have been like, okay, no, this wasn't a good idea. I would have preferred the Nordic country in this case.
It is conceivable in the abstract. I mean, if you imagine that, there's some kind of existential cosmic law that causes a society to spontaneously ignite if more than 80% of its economy is democratically owned. And,
That's not what we
no,
right.
of course.
We made all the theoretical. Yeah, okay.
Right. The circumstances to me are marginal. Or the likelihood of us reaching that point. It also depends on the types of negative externalities we're talking about. Because again, America's GDP back in, I don't know, 1950 was what, a tenth of what it is today? It's a tiny, tiny amount, right? Like compared to the economic productivity we had today. People have grown no happier since that time. Obviously, we've had a civil rights movement. That's a good thing. But I just don't think that GDP and happiness necessarily track that well outside of great economic inequality, which would be addressed by cooperatives, or great
Mm-hmm.
economic catastrophe, which is possible under any system. I suppose that could be a risk under any market economy. Even non-market
Yeah.
economies have been known to have their upturns and downturns. So to quit wheedling around, I think it's a marginal possibility, but it would be, I would imagine it pretty unlikely. I don't think the consequences of a broad worker cooperative economy could lead to such a thing. It would be very unexpected to me.
Okay. Yeah. I agree with a lot of the things you said about GDP, how it doesn't track perfectly. Although I think it's fairly inarguable that, like ceteris paribus, assuming all else equal, a society that has a higher GDP is going to be better off than a society with lower GDP, assuming everything else is the same within those two societies. Just that the numbers were different, and therefore the outcomes of those numbers are different. So we would both agree on this, right?
If everything else is equivalent, then
Yeah.
yes, I suppose a higher GDP would necessarily pertain to some kind of benefit.
Okay, yeah, excellent. I agree with that. Yeah, I guess then, and then I guess the summary is that, hey, I think that there, I think it is rational to assume and to believe that there is a significant risk for us seeing massive economic issues with a worker co-op mandate, and that is why I choose to not argue for it, and why I choose to not engage in rhetoric in favor of a worker cooperative mandate, because I believe in arguing and engaging in rhetoric in favor of things that I believe are very likely to lead to overall positive outcomes. And I think that there's worker co-op mandates with the risks we have right now. It's too risky of an advocacy for me personally.
I understand that, but I have to ask, would you then have been a loyalist during the American Revolution? Democracy was less
Fuck, you're
researched
testing my
then.
American history. Shit, I'm a European. Okay.
Sorry, would you have supported the
No, it's
American
fine.
Revolution as an American then? There was less research done on democracy then than there is on worker
Mm-hmm.
democracy now, and
Mm-hmm.
the revolution was a significantly more violent upheaval than anything which we can imagine being done now with some kind of federal mandate. A greater
Mm-hmm.
risk taken on less knowledge. Would you then have opposed it, said we don't have enough for this?
Um, this is a there's a very very simple answer to that. If I believed that the risks to engaging in the American Revolution had a significant and a substantial risk of leaving everybody worse off than before the revolution, then I don't see why I would argue in favor of such a revolution. And this is kind of this is necessarily is the case, right? I'm not going to argue in favor of something that I believe will like lead us and will have us be worse off afterwards, right?
Of course, but
So you can kind of like flip this in with anything.
it was a group of ragtag colonists fighting one of the strongest colonial powers in order to attempt a kind of political system that was essentially untested on a large scale before. In terms of risks and potentially negative outcomes, we're talking like massive negative, we're talking quite a lot of potential bad here. I guess the only point that I'm making is that sometimes these big leaps forward are taken on margins you wouldn't be comfortable with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if the likelihood of success for the American Revolution was, it would depend. So the reason why this is difficult to answer is that, okay, assuming that the discrepancies in the potential quality of life between America pre-American Revolution and American post-American Revolution was the same as the discrepancy in potential quality of life between social democracy and market socialism, and I had the same risk analysis where I believe that there was an equal risk of negative outcomes and negative outcomes when it comes to quality of life for us going to work a cooperative as for us doing the American Revolution, then logically I would have to say that I would have the same position with that as I would with this. But I don't know if those situations were the same. If those two requirements are met in the same way then as they're met now when it comes to the discrepancies in quality of life between pre-doing thing and post-doing thing, and when it comes to the percentage risk analysis that I have for worker co-op mandates and for American Revolution.
Well, given that they were colonists rebelling against a colonial authority, I think the negative consequences probably would have been losing and then having every third man, woman, and child crucified on the roadside or something. It would. I do.
Yeah, but then there's the other aspect to it as well, which is that, hey, the potential leap in quality of life between like living under a colonial monarchy compared to living in a democratic society.
But there
I think
wasn't.
that leap is sorry.
For the average peasant, their lives didn't change after the revolution. If you took the
Mm-hmm.
life of the average citizen of the United States back in 1832,
Mm-hmm.
non-slave, of course, compared to the average citizen of the United Kingdom at the same time, or England, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
they probably would have been pretty comparable. So we're talking about a huge, huge risk
Mm-hmm.
done for no immediate empirical gains in the quality of anybody's life, except, I suppose, for the founding fathers, the aristocracy, and slave owners. Um,
But it fundamentally allowed for massive improvements in quality of life for everybody in the future. Without that, you wouldn't have that same potential.
yeah, but they didn't know that. Democracy was untested. I think that it would
Mm-hmm.
allow for massive improvements to eliminate the bourgeoisie, right? But
Mm-hmm.
for you, it's more of a policy bit thing. In this case, democracy to them would have been more unfathomable. They didn't have democracies from which to pull examples. I can draw data from tens of thousands of existing worker co-ops. There's far more of an empirical basis for my beliefs, far less of a risk in implementing them than what they had, going on in their situation. Anyway, we're not. I don't want to argue the particulars of history. The only point that I'm making is that sometimes big positive changes have to be made based on standards that I feel as though you would not be comfortable with.
Um, yeah, I understand that why you may think that. And then just to finish the thing from before, so we talked about the risk, and it seems to very much be the case that the American Revolution was pretty fucking risky. I'm with you on that point. And then just to finish substantiating the second point of that, which is that I think that the discrepancy and the leap there between colonial monarchy and a democratic society with so much more potential for the increase of quality of life, I think that leap is significantly more substantial and,
They
and
didn't
a
know,
great bigger improvement than the leap between social democracy
but they
and
didn't
market
know it would be
socialism.
better.
Yeah,
They
but
didn't know democracy would be a preferable. A lot of them did legitimately think the average peasant was incapable of making reasonable choices to dictate the way the government. I mean, they didn't even have
mhm.
non-white landowning men vote for quite some time, right?
Yeah,
They didn't have any
and logically, I
info.
suppose if I believe that, then I would have been against the revolution. If that had been my beliefs, obviously, if I didn't think that, if I thought that the revolution would just be a complete and utter fucking disaster, and that even if it were accomplished, it would have negative outcomes, then obviously I would be against the American. Like,
But
yeah,
because you do believe in political democracy, you're willing to say now that
hmm
had you known the benefits of political democracy, the risk would have been worthwhile. In the same way that I believe in worker democracy economically,
hmm
I can make the argument that I think I'd be willing to make that leap um, for the proposal of a mandate for worker cooperatives.
and that would depend on the perceived strength of those theoretical arguments.
Oh, of course. But keep
Yeah,
in
okay.
mind that
And I don't
in
think the perceived
in the
strength of the theoretical
context.
arguments for worker cooperatives is equal to the perceived strength of the theoretical arguments for democracy.
Well, there are current arguments for worker democracy, but there weren't really arguments for political democracy at the time outside of what you'd find in philosophy texts. Outside of flowery words, they didn't really have any data. I mean, data collection on political decision making wasn't really even done back then, not in the way we do it now, at least. So, in both cases, a revolutionary then and I today am making the same leap in logic that democracy is worth dying for. And it's deeply American sentiment on my part, but I'm feeling a little patriotic at the moment. I feel like that's a worthwhile thing to believe in. Um,
Mhm.
though thankfully we won't even have to die for it, right? I mean, everything goes
Well, I
proper,
mean,
and
you were talking about blood and stuff before, so who fucking knows? But yeah.
that's going to be on them. If the proletariat decide they can do without the incredibly marginal, fractional bourgeois' involvement in the economy, the bourgeois can
Mhm.
go off and retire to the Cayman Islands and let us manage things from now on. I say us as though I'm a member of the proletariat, like normally, right?
Mhm.
But if there are any troubles there, it'll be on them. It was the same with the nobility. Oftentimes they just wouldn't give up power, even when it was very clear that they probably should. The British didn't leave America when we told them to. There were strongly worded letters sent across the Atlantic before the actual Revolutionary War happened. It always goes like this. People in power don't want to give it up.
Yep. Yep. And just to conclude that, I would say that I don't perceive the theoretical arguments for market socialism to be as strong as the way the American revolutionaries perceived the theoretical arguments for American democracy and for the American the American Constitution, the American experiment, so to say. So that would be how I would answer that
It's all right.
question.
I'll get you one of these days. Um, I,
Perhaps, yeah.
I do sincerely appreciate the conversation. I'm always happy to talk
Wait,
about
I
this
need
sort
to
of
push
stuff.
you on climate change stuff.
Oh, sure.
Okay. What do?
With climate change.
Yeah.
You mean what do, as in what can we get through the Senate? Or what should we do if we had the ability to better mandate the behavior? of
What is the best pragmatic advocacy we can do right now for climate change?
a combination of extremely ironic Roblox eco-terrorism, and all of the adjacent political... You put your hand in your face, buddy. There's no damage done through eco-terrorism that's not going to be done every nanosecond under a properly climate changed world.
Don't you think that the eco-terrorism could serve like really excellently towards the propaganda of, um, massive polluters and people who have an interest in not making us aware, not making us seriously tackle the issue of climate change?
They already won. They already did it. They didn't need any propaganda. All they had to do was say that it's woke to do the Green New Deal. I don't think
Well,
they need,
mhm.
um,
But for us to get anything, we're going from the premise that we're striving towards the capability to winning. We're striving towards them not having one and us actually having to do anything. That's the only way by which any of our solutions can actually succeed if we do win that fight.
policy
So,
decision-making is no longer a vehicle through which we're capable of averting catastrophe.
uh-huh.
At this point, blood is going to be spilled. It's either now or then. Billions of people are going to die as a consequence of climate change. As the waters rise, climate refugees are going to pour in from the coastlands, Southeast Asia, Central America. They're going to flood into countries that have extra room, like China and America, and we're not going to let them in. We're going to gun them down at the border and dump their bodies in mass graves. The death count will be in the 7, 8, possibly 9 digits, given a few decades of the real troubles. Given that, we're in a position where, from a consequentialist perspective, you could justify virtually anything in pursuit of stopping that from happening. So at this point, optics and even like relativistic moral considerations fall to the wayside. It's only pragmatism now. And pragmatically, half the things I think you could do to meaningfully improve the situation, I can't say on this platform. Of the things I can say on this platform, I would say that within the realm of pragmatic advocacy, you're fairly limited because nobody in government cares, because the government is controlled primarily by people who have the money to buy floating super cities where they can survive the end of the world without having to worry about all of us drowning. I swear to God, they're going to... DC's on a swamp, you know that? DC is on a swamp. It's pretty near sea level, I'm pretty sure. They're going to rebuild DC as a floating mega fortress somewhere out in the Atlantic.
Oh, I'm in Amsterdam right now, so
Yeah, it's going to have half of the US Navy surrounding it, and all of our
wow.
politicians are going to get to and from that place with helicopters, and they're going to
Mhm.
keep every year voting to not do anything meaningful. Now, in terms of what we can do, the issue is that working within the system has failed us completely because the people with the power to make these decisions don't care about the consequences, because at the end of the day, self-interest is not an effective, efficient, or introspective method of determining long-term social stability. We see this all the time with CEOs and their golden parachutes in corporations, or people who will make short-term, immediate benefit, decisions over long-term stability. When we're talking about millionaires and billionaires, like, who gives a fuck? Oh, they make $1 million today, but could have made $1 billion if they kept the economy running properly their whole lifetime. Who cares? Like, why would they care? It's still more money than they need. So this is one of the reasons why I care about worker democracy. I feel like there's a direct relationship between the fact that people in power to make decisions will suffer no consequences for any of this, and the fact that we've done essentially nothing to mitigate climate change.
Um, okay. So I understand your solutions. This would be my response to that. So number one, on Roblox eco-terrorism and the optics from that, I think that in order to be able to do effective advocacy in order to prevent climate change, one of the fundamental things, one of the groundworks that we will need in order to accomplish this is get as many people as possible on board with recognizing it as an issue and taking it seriously. I believe that the negatives in that towards that end are going to be caused by ecoterrorism are going to be stronger than the positives in disrupting international supply chains that pollute. Than the positives there that could ever be attained from ecoterrorism. I would think ecoterrorism would do more harm towards convincing more people and getting more people on board more than it would stop in any significant or meaningful capacity pollution.
What do
As for how
optics
we
do?
actually saw,
What is optics going to do? The Senate is split 50-50. What are optics
why
going
is
to
the
do?
Senate split 50-50?
Because the Senate is an undemocratic institution that favors the, election of people in rural areas, which will trend towards Republican voterships because voting Democrat correlates with city living because that correlates with education.
Because the country is it's not as divided. It's not proportionally divided towards the Senate because the Electoral College is a thing. But the country is still pretty divided, the United States of America at the moment. And hey, if
Because
we
of
had more, if we could get Republicans potentially on board with taking climate change seriously, we
why?
wouldn't have a 50-50 split.
Why would they? They haven't already. They're the reason we're in this boat. They worked directly with coal, gas, and oil executives to cover up and lie about information pertaining to climate change. They get from Murdoch-owned institutions like Fox News daily briefings on how to downplay climate change, in order to use it in an ongoing culture war dynamic against Democrats. Well, we're talking
So
about
I'm not
appealing
talking
to
about
the
the
sentiments.
politicians. I'm talking about the Republican voters.
What are they going to listen? What are what they listen to us?
I do believe that the ability for like fossil fuel executives or the anti climate change is a real lobby, the ability for them to weaponize eco-terrorism towards getting more people opposed to the anti climate change movement is going to that's going to have like a significant non-zero effect on the amount of conservatives that will, or the amount of people that will like take their climate change isn't a real thing. We shouldn't do anything about it. Look at these crazy radicals who are trying to do anything about
What
climate
about
change.
people who are motivated towards action themselves because they're inspired by the people who take direct action and engage in that eco-terrorism? It's like those tree-hugging
What does
hippies, right?
eco-terrorism like accomplish? There's no way you can disrupt the international supply chains
I don't
that
know.
cause all this pollution
How
with
many eco
eco-terrorism.
how many eco-terrorists do you have?
Yeah, you would need some crazy shit, okay, to have any I think to have any great significant effect on the amount of pollution that occurs right now through
The Suez
eco-terrorism.
Canal got blocked up for a few days, and that disrupted a significant portion of global trade. I feel like, given how fragile some of these institutions are, it
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't take. Oh, sorry, not Suez, Panama. Well, no, it was the Suez Canal, not Panama. Why, chat, shut
Mm-hmm.
up, Jesus. I feel like I feel like you could do some work, you know? The issue is that, like, what we're talking about here is the hope that, like, if we're all very good boys and girls, then maybe, in spite of decades of contrary evidence, the institutions that rule over us will go, oh, now we do care about this. And the people who we vote alongside, Republicans listen to Fox. They listen to the politicians they vote into. They construct their own culture war dynamics. If there's anything that I've learned while doing this job, it's that Republicans will believe anything they're told to believe from people who benefit from telling them to believe those things. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we're overcoming this. And even if we do, like, what
Wait, you
is
haven't
a
heard my solution yet.
oh, but like, even if we do, what is a American Biden-backed climate bill going to look like? What, tax credits for carbon capture? We need like real shit, something that a
Mm-hmm.
single country can't legally do. We need climate warfare. We need
We
real
need trade
work.
agreements.
We need that is not real work. That's not real work.
Okay, I gotta get to my to my solution and to this issue.
Okay,
So
yeah.
I would say that even if you had enough people to like block a massive canal, holy fuck, everyone that would be that would be affected by that blockage of the Suez Canal, unless they're adamantly already in favor of that type of practice, they would become incredibly resentful of climate change activists or whatever following that, and it would have very very negative effects on our ability to do something from an institutional level, which is what needs to be done in order for us to have enough power, from my perspective, to do anything about climate change. So what the solution to this is, okay? Number one, stop driving cars, start biking. Don't leave your taps on. I'm kidding. What needs to be done when it comes to climate change? And this is, I think, the most realistic policy that we could have towards trying to accomplish stuff like this. And it's a policy that I see us being able to get on board as many political coalitions as possible to strive towards it. And that is going to be multilateral trade agreements with extraordinarily strict requirements for pollutants and climate change and emissions and stuff like that. So how this is going to work is that you're going to capitalize on the liberal paradigm that exists right now and the general inclinations that we have in a globalized economy to desire multilateral trade agreements because they generally lead to increased economic productivity, higher GDP, things that institutions and governments care about. However, a massive thing about this trade agreement. It's not just going to be like, okay, now we're going to trade with each other. It's going to be, hey, we need the biggest global actors, economic and geopolitical, to step up and join this trade agreement. Let's say we get the US and we get the EU on board with this. And they're going to say that, like, hey, we're going to have a very strong trade agreement between the two of us now. And if you want to trade with us, you need to join this trade agreement. Otherwise, trade is going to be really inefficient. There are going to be tariffs. Your country is going to lose money from trading with us if this is the case. So there's going to be a massive economic pressure for countries to want to join that trade agreement. And as a requirement of joining the trade agreement, you must meet certain levels of emission standards in order to be allowed into there. If you're not meeting those standards, you're kicked out, bang, back come the tariffs, and your economy is going to suffer. So there's going to be an economic pressure for people to join this. As an effect of this, instead of one country like, taking the action and reducing their emissions, causing them economic issues, and therefore they're not going to want to do it because it leads to an overall loss in relative competitiveness on the international scale, because there's such a massive incentive and massive pressures for everybody to join this, you kind of set a floor or a roof for everybody when it comes to emissions that everybody can participate in. If everyone agrees through this trade agreement to hold this kind of like emission cap, then nobody can gain increased competitiveness, increased revenue, increased GDP from going past it, because if they do, they get kicked out and their economy fucking suffers as a result of this. So it's a way of kind of economically coercing countries through trade agreements to join in and to meet these requirements, else their economy suffers, which is something that institutions, which is something that governments care about.
Weren't you concerned about the optics of stuff that could lead conservative voters further right?
I think that the optics of a multilateral trade agreement with strict conditions is significantly better than the optics of eco-terrorism.
Well, the difference would be that this is something you could directly pin on governments. Like, you could immediately pin it on real officials rather than just random, like, actors who might not even be caught. But, like, in this case, the idea of, like, weakening American industry and making it non-competitive compared to China was literally one of the big talking points that got Trump into office. I don't think this is going to be any more optically effective to the right. I think they're going to tear this apart and make this like a sacrificial effigy.
That argument doesn't work, though. That argument of the loss of competitiveness
wait,
doesn't
do you
work.
think they care?
Do you think it's easier to argue in favor of something if you're actually correct as compared to if you're not?
No. Have you looked at Republican talking points? No, actually, if anything, it's easier to lie about things that aren't real, because that way you're completely untethered from from adherence to reality.
I don't see the reason why. Okay, why do you think the average Republican would be against this trade agreement?
Because they're told to be, from Tucker Carlson, and Tucker Carlson's told to do this from Murdoch. And Murdoch's told this because Murdoch, along with all the other ghouls who control Republican policy, want no government regulation whatsoever of industry, because it interferes with, I don't know, their Epstein Island croquet matches.
Okay. I mean, there are going to be pressures like pushing against whatever solution or whatever policy we have in order to try to ameliorate the issue we have with climate change. I would say, though, that the multilateral trade agreements are the best bet. I think that it's easiest to make the best arguments for those being the thing. I think you can play on a lot of the key principles and a lot of the key values that a lot of governing bodies and institutions really like and have engaged with in the past, such as internationalism, such as trade, such as like trade agreements, more efficient economies, a more interconnected economy, globalism,
don't get me wrong,
and the rest of it.
Your solution would be the correct one if we had leaders who cared about us, but we don't live in a proletarian state. Keep in mind, the Green New Deal was framed as anti-cow fart bills from Republicans. They don't care and they won't care. They don't care about human life. They don't care if everyone dies. They will never care. The overcoming the desire to believe in rational actors is one of the first steps of disbelieving in like the sustainability of our current political system. America has like a long running habit of leaving global bills because we don't like it when other countries tell us what to do, right? Like, we're not in the Paris Climate Accord. Well, Trump got us out of the Paris Climate Accords. We failed to sign the UN resolution on food being a human right. There are a ton of things that we just like. We don't like it. We don't like feeling beholden to other countries. All of this can be used for optics. But the problem is, because Republicans can just lie for news if they don't have anything real to go off of, optics ceases to matter. because giving them the W wouldn't be any different to them from an empty news day because they can make up a W. Like remember the news story that took place in, what was it, Tennessee, where they were like, this trans non-binary person raped a kid in a school bathroom, and it only happened because the school policy allowed for trans people to be in the bathrooms of their choosing. It was completely
Mhm.
made up, but Virginia, sorry, I'm still hearing talking points about that. Reality doesn't matter. Only blood and power matter. And since we are presently incapable of ousting the people in power from power, I feel like non-violent action against economic and ecologically relevant targets is, if any, unironically, a less optically damaging and more pragmatic line to run down. I guess, keep in mind, I'm pretty doomer about this, okay? I think we're fucked no matter what. Not because we couldn't do anything, but because we don't have the willpower to do anything. There are billions of humans that'll suffer the consequences of climate change, and America has more guns than people. If we had unified collective class consciousness, there's nothing we couldn't do. Um, but of course, that's unrealistic. We all have individual desires. We want to live to see the next sunrise. So, whatever. We're limited in certain respects in ways that they are not, because they command people and we merely live as them. But in terms of like, who's going to help us out of this, expecting federal governments to help with the climate change thing is like showing up to the site of a burning building that's been burning for 30 minutes, and there are firefighters outside the burning building, and they've been waiting there for 30 minutes. And somebody asks you, like, what do we do? And you're like, we should ask the firefighters who have been waiting there for 30 minutes. I think there's a
Mhm.
reason they haven't done this stuff before. Knowledge on climate change has been fairly public since the mid-70s, right? Like, this should have already been national emergency territory. The fact that it hasn't been treated that way for half a century is indicative that it won't be. That the life is just going to keep getting worse constantly. And for a while, Republicans are going to continue this whole "it's not happening" business, but we already see the transition taking place. Now it's not happening. It is happening, but it's not humans' faults. And that's going to be the line they run with. It's not our fault, and there's nothing we can do about it. I see conservatives, they say this now, oh, climate change is happening. Okay, fine. But, like, it's too late for us to do anything about it, so we might as well just live our lives. There isn't a situation where they get convinced to do the right thing because they're demons who wear human skin in an effort to trick boys and girls into their candy vans. They're not people, and they are trying to kill all humans. And they're paid very, very well to do these things. That's the level of contempt we need to approach this issue with. And to arrive at all that afterwards, the conclusion of maybe an oil pipeline getting bombed someday isn't the worst thing in the world. This is practically a moderate solution on my part. I mean, I feel like if anything, I'm pearl clutching. Like when I say
You must be a
eco-terrorism.
pearl collector then at this point. Holy fuck. Okay.
Huh?
I must be a pearl collector then.
Oh
If
well,
this is
it
if this is
depends.
pearl collection.
It depends in perspectives, but given the enormity of the circumstances that we face,
Mhm.
eco-terrorism is like the is like the avenged sevenfold of like black metal, right? I mean, I'm proposing, like, there are people out there without YouTube channels who make much more radical suggestions pertaining to issues like this, but you know uh Chat, yes,
Okay.
Avenged Sevenfold isn't black metal. That's the point. I'm saying that it's light compared to. Okay,
Uh,
I like Avenged
media
Sevenfold
takes.
though.
Your analogies are typical. From what I've heard, though, your general media takes might make your media analogy suffer a bit.
They're
From
mad
what I've
about my
heard,
perspective.
allegedly. Okay.
They're mad about my
Um.
perspective on Minecraft. They're angry that I'm a free-thinking maverick. Anyway, I don't mean to ramble. It's just it's about institutional trust, a thing
Huh?
at this point which I have very little of, and we're facing some really difficult times. You more than me. You're a decade younger than I am. You're going to live to see statistically. Well, actually, you don't live in America, so you're going to live, let's say, 14 more years than me. You're probably going to see a lot more suffering as a product of this stuff than I will live to see. It's going to be just remarkably, like, unimaginably bad. Um, our system just
Yeah.
isn't built to accommodate the rationale
Mhm.
of how to combat ideas like this. It goes beyond just legislator, right? The premise of a liberal democracy is let's all play civil because all of our differences should be settled through the mediums of democracy. And for the most part, I think that's a decent system, but
Yeah.
sometimes
Yeah, you think other solutions are necessary. I get that. So I'm gonna answer. I'm gonna give an argument
I'm
then
just
for.
rambling at this point. I apologize.
No worries. So I just want to clear that up. You brought up that, and then you said the argument didn't actually matter. But I just want to put this out there just so people are aware. Typically, the argument that's being made is that the Green New Deal, for instance, it wants to make it's going to make our manufacturing non-competitive. China's going to pick up everything, and then American economy is going to like go down the toilet. That argument doesn't work for the trade agreements because if China doesn't also join the trade agreement, what's going to happen? Massive parts of their potential export markets and of their imports as well are going to be part of this trade agreement, and there are going to be really strong sanctions and tariffs placed on that, and China's economy is going to fucking suffer a lot if
Wouldn't
they
that
don't join
hurt
the
our
trade agreement.
economy?
Sorry?
Wouldn't that hurt our economy? If we're
Partially.
tariffing them,
It's
then
very
that would.
important that you get a lot of actors in on it from the very get-go, especially like the big economic actors. That's the important part. If you only get like maybe like only the EU or only the like America to join it, then that would be pretty bad. But I think that if you get like really big geopolitical and economic forces like the entirety of the EU, maybe Australia, North America, you can get the entirety of the NAFTA group in on it, then you're going to have such a big like base to begin with that there still will be some negatives to the economy, sure, but it's going to be, per my understanding, per my analysis, going to be more likely that the people outside of the trade agreement are going to cave first before the people within it will. That would be my answer to that question. But I will say this, okay? The way I see this going, and the way I see this going, the way I hope this goes, is that we rally massive popular support for this specific policy. Instead of just being like, okay, climate change is a thing, we need like massive popular support. We need the voter base to be like, hey, we want this. This is what we need. This is what needs to happen. And then hopefully what we would see then is the elected representatives follow suit and, further, push for that and have that as part of their policy platform and move towards getting it done. I will say though, I understand why people are being like, hey, oh, it's unlikely we're never going to get this popular support or whatever. You might have that perception, but what I find pretty strange is that we can have this entire conversation about worker co-ops and market socialism, and there isn't a single thing was like, oh, there's no point even arguing for this. This is never going to happen. We're not going to get the average Republican on board with like something that might have socialism in the name or socialist roots or whatever. But then us talking about climate change here is like completely unattainable. This policy is not going to happen at all. I think that's a bit strange when it comes to the analysis there. But yeah.
Well, the difference is that in both cases, I'm taking the same position, which is to say we should do the most that we can. And you're taking the position that we should take the more limited or limited to the more pragmatic stuff. In the case of climate change, we have a pretty literal time limit. I don't think we should delay with the worker cooperative stuff either, but in both cases, my position is consistent, which is we can explore whatever available opportunities we have at the moment. Sure, don't get me wrong, but we should also do everything and anything because it's a non-negotiable point. And in terms of climate change, we don't really have an institutional forum for doing this that would work nationally, so I default to answers that come to me as more pragmatic. Whether we're talking federal institution of worker cooperatives or eco-robloxing, different directions you can take with that. Look, in a sane world, I think your proposal would work. In a proletarian world, I think your proposal would work. But I don't know.
I just feel like it's strange for us to have this conversation about climate change and like trade agreements. And it's kind of like, oh, this is naive, this is ridiculous, this is never going to happen. Following like a 2-hour conversation on worker co-op mandates and market socialism, that just feels a bit strange to me. And I'm gonna point this out here. But
well, you can say that my position on the worker cooperatives is naive and may not happen. Which my only answer is, it's entirely possible that's the case, but I'll fight for it anyway. We don't have the luxury of saying that about climate change because climate change isn't a thing we already live with that will stay this way unless changed. It is an inevitable wall of death hurtling towards us that we know will kill hundreds of millions of people. So the dynamics of avoidance here, I think, are a bit different. Don't get me wrong. I believe in advocating for the thing you're advocating for, but mostly just because it's a good idea in principle, not because I think it would work. I think at this point we're going to get pretty much no global solution to climate change up until we start like losing cargo ships to hurricanes in the Atlantic. And after that happens, rather than meaningfully addressing the issue, we're probably just going to see a tightening of supply lines, austerity the world around, and probably billions spent on reinforcing anti-climate change infrastructure in parts of towns that are wealthy. I'm reminded vividly of how the National Guard protected Beverly Hills during the police riots in 1993 in Los Angeles. I feel like we're going to get something kind of along those lines. And there will be looting and there will be riots because places will be destroyed by tornadoes and hurricanes, and cold snaps will leave people frozen to death in their homes. People will die of heat stroke out in the streets. It's going to be a miserable fucking affair. And I genuinely don't think there's anything we can do at this point to stop this from happening, apart from preparing for it on an individual level. But if you could do anything, there's nothing you could do that would be immoral if it was being done to effectively prevent what was taking place. Very much
Mhm.
a asteroid hurtling towards Earth or aliens trying to blow up the planet type situation. Eco Robloxism, yeah, well, whatever. Other fancy solutions that people have come up with in the past for getting rid of inconvenient political actors. I don't know, whatever. The world's your oyster. A lot of people are going to die. It just seems unfortunate that people would die.
Okay.
It's a
But then
political position of mine.
I'm gonna make a. I'm gonna make a. Maybe this is just this. Maybe this can be you. What's it called? You politely playing into my delusion and naivete. But you say that you are in favor of that I'm the person that argues for what is pragmatic and what is like kind of like realistic within how things are operating today, while you argue and you're in favor of like every possible thing that we could do towards moving towards it. So in the future, in discussions about climate change, will you argue in favor of a multilateral trade agreement as a potential policy, as I've done now?
Oh yeah. Oh no, it would be a good thing to do. Yeah. I think that the U.S. should also subsidize green energy production both domestically and abroad, and the West
Mhm.
and other industrialized nations probably have a moral and political responsibility to essentially just buy green energy infrastructure for countries that never had a chance to experience an industrial revolution in like the fullest extent. Yeah.
Mhm.
No, I fully believe that. Yeah. I mean, I feel very much ironically like I'm tilting at windmills when I say this,
Mhm.
I feel like a person suing for peace back in like 1939 or something. But yeah, no, these are good ideas. I don't disagree. It's just, um, it's just. I guess I would wonder how far into the troubles you would have to get before you would give up hope in institutional solutions. You know what I mean? Like at what
Mhm.
point would Rose wrist go like, the government has failed us, it's time to take to the streets, comrade, shuka bliet, and you have like a rifle or something. They have
I'll
guns in
call
your
upon my
country?
1/8 Russian ancestry for that one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, was that a question or was that a thought?
No, sincerely. Like what, like, obviously I'm being a little bit hyperbolic with the language here, but at what point
Mhm.
do you feel that, you've had an institutional failing that can't be redressed through electoral solutions, and at this point it's just about power and who has the guns?
Okay. Yeah. So I mean the so there's going to be I'm going to give an answer now, which is going to sound like a bit weaselly, and then I'm already thinking about that next part. So the answer to that is obviously when I would take action is I would take action at the point where I believe that action outside of institutions is likely to be more fruitful and more productive than action, than trying to work with the institutions and with the big power bases. But your question is, what would push me to that point where I would make that analysis, and I would believe that to be the case. I would say that right now, the major issues that we have with institutions, that is making action kind of slow and that is pushing against the ability for us to do a lot of things that are very important and that require immediate attention. I think a lot of those issues, such as the influence and lobbying within politics, the massive spreads of misinformation, the great wealth inequalities that exist within society. I think those things can be significantly fixed and significantly ameliorated through working within the system. We have seen examples of in the past and current countries that exist today that are capable of handling these types of issues in a better way than what America does. I think that if this whole situation of climate change, if another country, maybe like a Nordic country, had this amount of like geopolitical and economic power that the US does, and therefore the amount of responsibility that they would have for taking a step up in resolving conflicts like the climate change, I think that they would have a much better shot than the US does. And they're able to accomplish those things with reforms and while still operating through institutions and through the democratic method. So it would have to be at a point where those types of things are it's not possible for us to reform those types of things that are negatively and adversely affecting our institutions. At that point, maybe I could see some other actions being taken, but I'm not there because I have seen these types of like, policies and being able to reform the negatives I listed with countries that exist today. So I'm maybe I don't know enough America, or I'm not properly thinking about America, or I don't have the correct conceptualization or understanding of the situation that it's in. That may well be the case, but yeah, that's where I'm at.
It's difficult to conceptualize. For most of human history, outside of liberal democracies, the only way to effect political change was with torches and pitchforks. That was actually, this is very much a return to tradition moment. For the longest time, that was just the only way that anything happened. If aristocrats were overthrown, nobility taken down, it was a mass of angry peasants. That was just the thing that had to happen. And now we have been conditioned into believing that the entirety of necessary political action can be framed within the confines of liberal democracy. And again, I like democracy, but I feel like there are some people weighing the scale down a bit, institutional interests, the bourgeois, corporatism, that make it really difficult for us to bring about a democratic system that meaningfully reflects the will of the people. Or, to put it better, meaningfully reflects the class-conscious will of the people, because the will of the Nazi people was for more Lebensraum, so obviously the will of the people isn't the only important thing there. People will what you tell them to will, so you need good education and la-di-la-di-la.
Wait, to be very clear, I am in favor of things like protests and people taking the streets, and of civil disobedience against public institutions and public entities. I am in favor of all of those things. I think this is perfectly fine. I'm not arguing for, hey, let's not in any way like significantly show our disagreement or what's going on. I'm in favor of all those types of those organizations. I'm not at eco-terrorism yet, but it's not like I'm just like, hey, just civilly express your shit on the internet. I'm in favor of people going out on the streets and massively, expressing their support or their distaste for things in a way that is in your face.
I think there are some forms of No, I get it. I think there are some forms of eco-terrorism that have gotten quite popular in retrospect, right? I think, weren't there people who back during the logging craze, they would like go sabotage like John Deere equipment or something? It's no people
and
hurt.
they would also and then there's also a lot of negative history of eco-terrorism as well, right? So for instance, I think it was logging as well, where people would put like I think it was steel pipes or something of the sort like inside trees, and then if someone were to cut them off with chainsaws.
Yes. I don't agree with that.
And that's disgusting. That's terrible.
Right, of course. Well, there are ways to appropriately manage this kind of stuff. Yeah, of course. At the end of the day, the reason why people protest, ideally protests would fix anything and everything, but what we protest and how we protest are very harshly limited by the confines of what discourse we're allowed. Past a certain point, it's not liberal democracy. It's liberal democracy as it exists within the confines of this box that has been built for us by our betters. what can we think about? What issues are worth discussing? What talking points do people express publicly and thus shift discourse to be around? We don't actually have any control over these things. The will of Murdoch, of the Fox News owner, is worth the votes of 100 million Americans. He needs but give a memo, and highly paid propagandistic disinfo peddlers will write the script of the next presidential election. In a system such as that, when we really start looking at the numbers, like one man's life against how much harm? How many people die because of bad healthcare systems? How many people die as a product of exposure, poor insulation, lack of access to food? Civil answers are not always the moral ones, and moral answers are often, when televised, not pretty. After all, the civil rights movement was pretty optically bad. Martin Luther King was disliked by the majority of Americans back when he died.
Mm-hmm.
Only worth keeping in mind that sometimes the confines of optical consideration are really just what they do and don't want you doing. Because I'll tell you this much, okay? The coal, oil, gas industries fear eco-terrorists a fuckload more than they fear protesters. Shitload more. That's why they put so much goddamn time and effort into making sure that people don't become the former and stay limited to the latter.
Possibly. I would say that the best bet that we have is we need to get as many people on board as possible. We must be incredibly vocal and incredibly aggressive with our advocacy for these things. We need to demonstrate our opinions and our positions and what we want in a very in-your-face, aggressive, upfront way. Big protests, like generally large swaths of the public opinions, large demands for our public representatives, and we need to go really hard on those types of aspects. And I have enough faith in the democratic institutions that I would hope that I would believe that the elected representatives would begin to reflect and would begin to pick up on that massive potential in that voter bloc for appealing to the things that these people are that we're clamoring for as a population and as a voter base. I have a question for you though.
I hope so too.
If you're at this point where you're really is it kind of like exclusively climate change that you feel this way about, or uniquely climate change?
Climate change has the big timer on it. With regards to fascism in the US, we also have a timer on that. We probably have half a century before that, at most half a century before that, really comes to bear. On those two things, we have timers. On a lot of other issues, we have the ability, the wiggle room, to flex out our decisions a little bit more.
Yeah, but when it comes to your doomerism towards getting things done, is that something that's unique to climate change, or is that to a lot of things, a lot of very important
it's
things?
the climate change is the one that I have the most negative opinion on, for sure.
Is it because it's a time limit, or is it because you think it is going to be uniquely difficult to get things done on climate change as compared to other things?
Well, both. There is a time limit, and also it requires global intervention in a way that we could have been doing for the past 50 years, but we haven't been at all and still continue to not do right now, even though scientists continue to warn us every single year that things are already really bad and will continue to get worse unless we change things, and then we don't change things, and they tell us the same thing the next year.
Okay, I should ask this question a bit more clearly. Do you believe that it is that we have the similar? There's a similar degree of difficulty in being able to accomplish progress towards solving climate change as compared to things like the healthcare stuff you mentioned previously?
No, the climate change stuff is the hardest stuff to manage by far.
Okay, I guess that makes sense then.
It's very much a unique problem, not just because it's global, but also because it's really difficult to convey to voters the specificity with or the necessity for a bunch of things that would need to happen. Right, of course. Also, there's no way to address climate change meaningfully without some kind of hampering of our economy. More resources need to be dedicated towards climate change being fought. So, people are going to fight against that as well. The fascism stuff, while tied to economics, is more culture war oriented, which is something that is more ideologically weighted. I think it's something that you have the capacity to more meaningfully engage with within the purview of acceptable discourse in a system. That's not to say that I think positively of that system, only that I think it's slightly more possible to, work within it on that issue.
Okay. All right. So then so I'm gonna hold you at your word then, okay? If the topic comes up towards of like what do we do about climate change, I better hear you mention the trade agreements next time, okay?
I'll try
Otherwise,
to remember. It isn't
you're
a
gonna be in
bad
trouble, okay?
idea. I do hope
Well,
they do that. It's just,
mhm.
well, they should have done it
Yeah.
50 years ago.
I suppose, yeah. Okay. I think those are the main things I had written down. Do you have any questions or anything for me?
No, I think it's been a remarkably thorough conversation, and I really do appreciate you taking the time to speak with me. I enjoyed it a lot.
And I will say that I appreciate you finally accepting European legitimacy by beginning to stream early, so I don't have to be up at 2 a.m. having this conversation. That's
Yes.
remarkably nice of you. But yeah.
Yes,
Um,
my pleasure to be accommodating. We love to accommodate disabilities on my anti-ableism stream.
okay. Wow. All right. I see how it is. Jesus. Oh, I was gonna ask this as well. Are you going to? Are you coming to TwitchCon in Amsterdam?
I can't. I'm banned from Twitch.
Oh, right. Wait. Are you banned from TwitchCon as well?
I assume so, right? They only let partners past the gilded doors. I doubt they let people
Okay.
who are banned in at all. There are always Twitch
Damn.
streamers streaming in there, so if they caught a glimpse of me, they might get banned.
Okay, so then I will ask again. Here's the European has more access to the important things and is being privileged more than the American in this case. Isn't that
Yeah,
curious?
don't say cracker, okay? They really don't like that.
Wait, am I not supposed to be streaming this on Twitch?
Wait, are you streaming this on Twitch?
No, I'm kidding. I stopped the
Okay,
record.
I don't know. Well, people have been getting away with it lately. Destiny
Uh,
has an 8-hour watch sesh of me every day, apparently. So
yeah, I
some
asked chat about it.
flexibility.
Apparently, there's a difference between reacting to content and having direct conversations.
That
And
that
I heard that.
distinction did not used to exist. There were people from
Mhm,
my original ban who would cover my stuff and get banned for it. I remember, I think Our Relevant got banned for it at one point. So did
mhm.
another person. I think the Surfs did at one point. Twitch is just really arbitrary with their ban rules.
Okay. Yeah, a lot of people have gone away with reacting to your content recently, so I assume they probably rolled that back a bit. But I wasn't going to be the, I didn't want to be the. There's a collective action problem now. I don't want to be the first person who has you in a direct conversation on stream and has to bear the
Controversies.
consequences.
I don't know what you're talking about. Well, I'll appeal the ban eventually. With my many CIA contacts, it won't take long for me to cut through that.
I see.
I will now quell the people in chat who are angry with me for my hyperbolic language. Thank you for taking the time.
Yeah, it was a nice conversation. I hope you have a great rest of your day and rest of your stream.
You as well. Be well.
Bye bye.
I think that was a pleasant and informative conversation. I'm happy with conversations like these because they make me feel like a proper socialist. Vaush, why is spiking trees bad? People who are chainsawing down trees may be doing harm, but they're honest members of the humble proletariat. They probably don't know much about or are not very ideologically invested in the goals of their corporate overlords. The only thing you do by spiking trees is decapitate members of the proletariat. Eco-Robloxism, when practiced appropriately, is entirely capable of disrupting supply lines without ever harming human beings, which is not only optically preferable, but technically preferable. Because, as it turns out, humans are replaceable. Oil pipelines, well, they're also replaceable, but they take a lot more money to replace. It's more difficult to manage that. Anyway, I saw a couple of people, nice fucking meme, crazy clip, u1lib.org/book. Of course it would have lib in its name soaked on left. That's the kind of link you would share with me. A few follow-throughs to the fine people in chat. Anybody who feels like I was being hyperbolic with my language, I'm really sorry. I don't think that I am. There were a few people here who seemed to accuse me of virtue signaling, but I believed everything that I said. I do have a strong ideological bias towards democracy and freedom as concepts. I do think it's worth making sacrifices for a worker cooperative economy, but I don't think we'll need to. I think that I think it'll be a holistically better economy. I'm only saying that I would be willing to. I felt it necessary to point out that in the past, major ideological shifts are usually predicated on something approximating a leap of faith, which is just how the world works sometimes. That doesn't mean we should never make big changes. This isn't the end of history. Listen, if you're not willing to make big changes, the world will make big changes for you. That's the lesson that climate change should teach everyone, okay? People aren't willing to rock the boat and disrupt the economy by meaningfully fighting back against climate change. Well, you don't get a choice in the matter. The boat is getting rocked one way or another. You choose whether it's from your behavior or from a hurricane moving through. You get to choose that. You know, it's like complaining about rocking the boat when people are saying that you're being too aggressive and steering the ship away from the edge of a waterfall. You know, okay, maybe my steering is a little bit rough. It's a waterfall, and we are not going over that fucking thing. Except in this case, it's actually a series of waterfalls, and we've already fallen down like 19 of them, but there were like 100 more, so, you know. Yeah, my cheese, I'm not intent on dismissing the possibility that there may be negative consequences of the implementation of any system that I believe in, because I think that would be ridiculous. Yeah, Demon Mama, I'm a little limited with regards to the extent to which I can say stuff like this. Eco-memerism, whatever. But yeah, I honest to God, I really do feel like that's a moderate position at this point. Like, I guess I feel like so much of this is abstracted by the fact that people live in the world they live in right now, and for that reason, they don't think of things the way they would if not besieged by ideology. But can you imagine a fantasy setting in which you know, an asteroid is about to hit the planet and kill hundreds of millions of people, and it's a preventable asteroid hit, and the only reason that the asteroid is not, like, the only reason the asteroid's going to hit the planet is because it's being, like, directed by, like, magnet beams that a few wealthy, like, plutocrats make money from, and you could just turn those off, and the asteroid would, like, whoosh away. We are literally talking about a situation in which the greed of a small number of people is going to kill more people than any other thing that has ever killed people before. We're talking about the obstinance of nation states and the greed of the bourgeois leading directly to what is essentially the closest thing to a human-oriented mass extinction event that has ever taken place. Unimaginable suffering. Nothing else in human history compares to it. Nothing humans have ever done to other humans or have had happen to them comes even remotely close. There is no genocide. There is no plague, no disease, no war that will even come close to the harm done by climate change. It is in a league of its own. It is unimaginably, just unfathomably beyond anything we have otherwise been capable of doing to each other. In any sane world, the people who have spread propaganda denying the existence of climate change will be remembered alongside Adolf Hitler and like King Leopold, with the predominant exception being that Hitler and Leopold's death counts were in the 7 to 8 digit range, and these guys are going to hit 9 digits, maybe 10. That's the critical difference there. Like, in any sane world, like, I don't think this is like ideology speaking on my behalf. I think I am just saying the world the way it is. I don't think I'm giving you guys like some crazy out there narrative. This is literally just what is happening right now. They knew about climate change. They've known about it since the 1960s. They did research internally, didn't share it with the public, lied about it publicly, continue to lie about it, pay politicians to lie about it. The media lies about it because the media is owned by the same people who also have heavy shares in these industries. Like, this is such a clear-cut case, okay? Now, for all of that to be the case, and for me to say, maybe a little eco-Roblox wouldn't be so bad, guys, if we were talking about an anime fantasy world, would you have any fucking problem with the anime fantasy protagonist blowing up one of the factories that was leading to this murder of hundreds of millions of people? Shit like this happened in fucking The Last Airbender. Literally, The Last Airbender sabotaged a number of... Yeah, Final Fantasy VII is literally about this. If you... Like, libs will watch The Last Airbender and go, yes, I love it when Aang destroys the infrastructure of the Fire Nation because they're the bad guys. Except, hey guys, did the Fire Nation kill hundreds of millions of people? I don't think they did. That seems unlikely. I don't know if there were that many people in their world. Okay. Seriously. And listen, okay? The critical difference between me and like your average fucking American lib, not Rose Wrist, but like your average fucking American lib, okay, is that if they were in the world of The Last Airbender and they saw Ozai about to do his fucking fire endgame move during Sozai's comet or Sojin's comet across the Earth Kingdom when he was just about to fucking charcoal the entire continent or whatever, they would be like, "Okay, well that's not good, but like taking down his airships, you want to engage in terrorism against this nation state's like industry, like, except again, the Earth Kingdom probably didn't have hundreds of millions of people on it, so we're talking about again a worse. There's no comparison I can draw that it effectively captures the harm, you know. Even in fucking Harry Potter, they attack. Dude, God, it's so frustrating, dude. How liberals will make media where they're like, it is okay to fight back against evil, even if it means sometimes having to destroy property and do violence. And then in reality, we're seeing like a fucking apocalypse tier scenario. And they're like, no, no, not like that. No. No. The reason why is because liberals are authoritarians who need to be given the go-ahead by their nation state to say it's okay to take care of the problem. That's why. They need the nation state to step in and go, hey, that's another country and we're at war, so now it's morally okay to do this. That's the difference. They can never accept moral culpability for the equation themselves. They need an ultimate power to give them permission to stop thinking and to let some other institution do the work for them. Which is, of course, a bad fucking system, because generally speaking, when nation states tell you it's okay to kill another group of people, they're not doing it for fucking humanitarian reasons. But, you know, that's what liberals need. That's what liberals desire. That is the thing that they need. They can't make the moral decision by themselves, because absent the doctrine of a state, the default message is violence bad, property damage bad, and that's the extent of their thinking. And they need the go-ahead switch being toggled by a nation state in order to do the rest of the work. You're really spitting today? Aw, thank you. How you guys doing? Tree spiking hasn't hurt anyone. Read the Wikipedia page. Wait, really? Wait, I heard that tree spikings definitely hurt people. Excuse me. It says somebody was injured in 1987? There's only one injury listed here. Wow, is it that little? Huh. Oh wait, this is based. In 2021, President Biden nominated Tracy Stone Manning to lead the Bureau of Land Management despite her involvement in a 1989 tree spiking plot. Comrade Biden appointing his revolutionary compatriots to positions of power. That's my fucking president. I love being the type of socialist who can whiplash between smearing all liberals and then saluting Biden. This is the best place to be. Nothing else even comes close. It's really not that dangerous. I don't recommend it. I don't recommend it. Is this correction going in the Rose Wrist video? I don't think it meaningfully changes. So wait, eco Roblox, but where no one gets hurt? Dude, people. Okay. I'm okay, listen. Here are the things Here are the things that are morally justifiable to prevent climate change. Here's what I can talk about on stream. And then of those things, here's the things that I can talk about without dog whistling. So let's talk about this range, okay? So eco-Robloxing, all right, doesn't need to be directed against human targets because, as I said before, humans are replaceable and most of the people you're going to hurt are just like innocent workers, whereas damage done to infrastructure is unimaginably more difficult to repair and deal with. You know what? How about this, okay? How about this? Don't take any info from me, because I'm not that well read on it. Instead, what you guys can do is wait 10 years when eco-terrorism is being relayed to you every single night over the news, because people are inevitably going to do this anyway, because our lives are going to end, or at least become dramatically worse, and given situations like that, people are going to lash out. So, if anything, you can wait 10 years, learn from example. Any, you have to at me if you want to at me. You haven't presented any tactics that would be meaningful. You're just vaguely gesturing at eco-terrorism as a helpful element while discrediting any reform work, and I find that to be a misunderstanding over leverage. I'm discrediting it only in that it's not going to happen and hasn't happened, not that I don't think it would be useful. I think in a properly sane world, you know, the idea that like trade blocks could form to tariff like governments that don't do certain climate change reforms would be a workable idea. You know, it's just a matter of like what's actually going to happen, right? If you don't actually have an idea of how you can better inspire people to do this way, you're LARPing in favor of low revolution simply because it's not a liberal position. You misunderstand any. I'm limited in what I can say because I'm on a platform right now, okay? If any action is going to be done to prevent climate change, it is not going to be done electorally. It'll be done brutally painfully in a manner which entails a great deal of unnecessary suffering, and that is the world we are hurtling towards. This is not a prescriptive judgment on my part. This is descriptive. This will happen. You'd have to be insane to think it won't. I'm only saying that you should be prepared for this world. You can advocate for electoral solutions if you like, but I wouldn't hold your breath for them. Nothing meaningful, at least. I would, however, take into account the fact that life can be hard sometimes. Sometimes you live through history. Maybe it'll be us, maybe it'll be our children, okay? But something's going to happen. Or at least a lot of things are going to happen in quick succession. And we just need to be ready for it. Hence my armory that I'm slowly building. Jesus, Sag. Don't you give me that. Chat, with respect, you guys realize that life was uncertain for all of human history up until we invented air conditioning, right? You guys literally live as like the third generation to exist after life stability became just a thing people expect in the West. And they don't expect this in the rest of the world, by the way. Do you think the people who were part of the Arab Spring revolutions are just like, oh, we live through history now? Bummer, man. No, life for them was never certain. You guys, not all of you in chat, I know that, but at least a lot of you, you're doomer about this because you've never lived with anything else. Most of human history has been living in the fear that the next winter could lead to the death of your children. The next harvest could be insubstantial and you could be punished by your lord, you know? Most people lived in fear that the cough they're developing from their 18 hours in the coal mine isn't just a regular cough, but could be black lung. Most of life, for most people, has sucked for as long as we've existed. Now, thankfully, we have the internet now. For those of you who watch that lovely Doomer Media conversation, things are better for a lot of people in the West. Things have gotten a little bit more stable, but listen, a little bit more stable does not mean guaranteed, okay? It's okay to feel bad about it, but please do keep in mind that the prospect that in a couple of decades life might get bad and violent, the fact that that makes you uniquely upset, that is a privileged prospect. Because if you're living in a bunch of other countries right now, if you live in Gaza, if you live in Libya, if you live in Afghanistan, if you live in a fuck ton of countries in fucking Central Africa, okay? And if you live in Ukraine right now, these aren't guarantees they had. These aren't like, this isn't a shattered expectation or a broken promise. It's still bad, don't get me wrong. That's not to say that you should just like nut up and deal with it. I'm only pointing out that there is a solidarity to be found here between the situations we find ourselves in now and those of a great many people. How many people have died thinking they were witnessing the end days of civilization hundreds of years ago? How many people died in Pompeii? Huh? They must have thought it was the end of all things. How many tribal villages were overrun by Genghis Khan? How many millions of people died fighting his armies thinking that's the end? The evil empire won. But now Genghis Khan and his empire are dust. How many people fell to the Romans, or who fell with the Romans as the Roman Empire collapsed like 6 times? How many people were there for the death of the Grecian city-states, or for the death of democracy when they were inevitably turned or corrupted or fell apart or were invaded or conquered or annexed? How many people were there for what felt like the end of the world during the great split of the Catholic Church, during the Protestant Revolution, during the Catholics who were purged, or the Christians who were purged in Rome and sent to go fight lions in the Colosseum, you know? The Cold War Nuclear war, the Black Death, half of Europe dead, starvation every winter. Do you know how many fucking people died when they came to the New World? There were settlements built along the east coast of the United States that were just found by later colonists empty. Frozen corpses littering the ramshackle wooden palisades of the makeshift civilization they had built, unable to properly farm and therefore to survive. So many people have died thinking, it's the end, it's over. And you know what? So far, every single one of them has been wrong. Literally every single one of them, okay? Literally every single time they've been wrong without exception because things kept going. Now, is climate change worse than every situation I've just described put together? Yes. But you know what? I think we're going to make it through too. You know why? Because after enough humans die, industrial production will slow down to the point that the Earth's temperature levels out again. Kablamo. We've had these heat and cold shocks before. Humanity as a concept will probably survive in some form. 1,000 years from now, they're going to be growing maize and oranges, in what remains of the Northern Californian, farming belt. And they're going to be like, damn, people used to be really dumb 1,000 years ago. And they're going to bite into an orange and say, yep. There will be, listen, okay? It's the year, though they won't know it, is 3,827, okay? And the Giga Chad of the local village who lives in what remains of Idaho is just deep dicking his girlfriend, okay? Absolutely just fucking tunneling the walls. I mean, just excavating her, okay? And they're doing so on the rusted, dilapidated remains of a concrete shelf that used to be the roof of a banking building that occupied that place nearly 2,000 years ago. And they don't know why that concrete's there. They know it's concrete. They don't know it was a banking building or whatever. And they will briefly reflect, well, again, while the back walls are being, absolutely blown out, at how silly the old people were. Because we do that today when we go look at their old ruins. Do you understand? Do you understand the perspective? Everything continues. Everything keeps going. Right now, Cairo in Egypt, thrives in the shade of the pyramids. That was like fucking 1 billion years ago, okay? Things keep going. And you know what? If things don't keep going, then some other fucking advanced species is going to evolve and replace us, okay? We already have monkeys. You think we can't monkey twice? I bet Earth could monkey like 3 times easily. We got plenty of time before the sun expands and encompasses the orbital belt of Earth, or makes this uninhabitable. We can monkey 4 times, maybe. We can do it. It's possible. Now, they won't know what the concrete was. They won't get it. Oh, and here's a fun little bonus, okay? We only get to make this mistake once. Humanity has already mined basically all of the essential metals and extracted all the natural gas, oil, and coal anywhere near the surface of the planet. So any future civilization that comes about will have absolutely no way of redoing climate catastrophe. They will not have the resources which will allow them to do so. So they're going to be elves. They'll have to live with wood in the forests, I guess, and they'll have like bone spears or something. I don't know. That's fine. That's fine. Like, that's fine. Imagine humans with modern levels of education, but they're all like living in trees. I don't know. Maybe they stay in the redwoods. That'd be nice. Redwoods are nice. I used to live there. That'd be pretty. I'm rambling about all of this because I think it's really important to maintain an appropriate sense of perspective, because when you do so, it makes it a little bit easier to emotionally and intellectually comprehend what climate change represents, okay? We should always think of these terrible crises and occurrences not as the end times necessarily, even if it may be rhetorically, effective to do so, but rather as a link in a long chain, a continuous line of Earth's history and those who inhabit it. And we have the power to make things better or worse, but, we should always temper our understanding of the problems with, an appropriate degree of perspective. It's one of the reasons why I really like the end of Adventure Time. I guess spoilers, but like the final episode of Adventure Time, the show, nice show, is 1,000 years in the future, and the protagonists are long dead. Really, that's the it's really quite perfect. I think. You know, you have this wacky post-nuclear world, you know, the whole world of Adventure Time is is after a nuke went off. You know, it's a whole thing. And at the end of the show, here, what is it? Final episode future. And you know, you meet all these wacky people, all the cool stuff happens, a bloody bloody blah. And then you know, the final episode takes place and the main characters are dead. Everyone's dead. Because it's way in the future, dummy. That's what happens in the future. And you just follow these two people who look and act kind of like our protagonists, wandering what's left of the world. Everything that used to be there is now gone or different. Things have grown, died, changed. The whole point is that life goes on, and these guys get to have their own adventure. Even though they will never know the people who lived 1,000 years ago, they still walk in the footsteps of them. And that's nice. Things change. But things never change. That's the moral. We're getting profound in here by referencing children's animation. Here we go. Here's SDL being a nerd. One moment. Vaush lib ideological opposition to eco-terrorism because violence bad, uwu is dumb, but there's also pragmatic opposition. Eco-terror is unlikely to seriously reduce global climate change. The eco-terror may make it harder to obtain power and obtain the necessary green policy. I guess it really... I understand there's a factor there, but that is sort of an optics thing, right? I mean, it's degrees of consideration, but if you believe, as I do, that there was a time for institutions to fix this problem, and it was 50 years ago, and the fact that they can't do it even now when everything is as obvious as it ever will be, past a point, you know, the potential for institutional engagement, well, you know, really depends on how optimistic you feel like being about the whole thing. Another comparison could be Outer Wilds. Oh, that's right! Outer Wilds is perfect! You guys remember Outer Wilds? You explore the remnants of 2 dead civilizations in that game. It's a really good game. I played it on stream. People who don't watch my gaming streams aren't people, and I don't respect you. You're actually stockpiling weapons to prepare for a climate catastrophe. I stockpile weapons because I have excess income and because they're shiny. You should stockpile flashlights and clean water. If you guys actually care about some doomer prepperism, please don't buy into any of that right-wing bullshit, okay? Please don't buy any of those fucking nutrition sludge buckets where you pay $150 for a 30-pound can of, like, bean broth, okay? I beg of you, please do not, okay? If you actually care about emergency preparedness, here's the first thing you need to understand. You're basically fucked anyway. Sorry, if you guys live in a city, deluding yourself into believing that having 100 cans of beans lying around is going to solve your problems if things go to shit is deluding yourself. Long-term sustainability in a genuine crisis situation. This isn't to speak of an earthquake. An earthquake is living through a few days, maybe, or a week, depending on how quickly the government gets to, you know, or if you're in Haiti, forever. In Haiti, earthquake preparedness means your whole life. But if you're talking about anything more substantial than that, like civilizational collapse, what you don't need is resources to make you through a month. What you need is the ability to build a new life without any conveniences of modern infrastructure. So have fun reinventing agriculture. You know, yeah, it's not. Social skills are actually by far going to be the most important thing if anything really bad happens. Having a fuck ton of beans is going to keep you alive for a bit until somebody takes them from you. Being good friends with everyone in your neighborhood is way more likely, to procure a beneficial outcome. Make sure you all are friends, and then you can stockpile the beans, and you can have people on bean watch, so that when everyone else is sleeping, they get the gun, okay? So when raiders try to steal your beans, they then use their social skills to convince the raider to be part of their bean party. Join them on the bean watch, and eventually you form a bean army. You understand. The extinction of autistic people, lol. It'll be a rough time for them. It'll be a rough time. Beans don't taste good, I wouldn't be motivated enough. You can do anything. Just add some salt and pepper, or some garlic powder or something. They're beans. They're, like, infinitely malleable. Also, what types of beans? I will admit that refried beans, if they don't have any cheese or sour cream or Greek yogurt mixed in, are kind of ass, but I normally just eat black beans. In terms of just like what bean you'd want to live out the apocalypse through, um, I feel like red kidney beans might be the best, right? Does anyone else feel like red kidney beans are the most like vital, like they provide the most nutrition or something? I don't know if they actually do. They just kind of feel like it. Like black beans and pinto beans just kind of feel like, well, I mean, they're not bad. I love them. Don't get me wrong, but they feel like the chips of beans. But red kidney beans, I feel like, yeah, I don't know. They taste oddly like meat too. Yeah, they're pretty approximate to a protein base, I feel. Healthiest beans chart. Ooh, hold on. Hold up. Oh, chickpeas. Chickpeas are at number 1. Well, I like chickpeas a lot, but I don't know if I'd want to eat like 2 cans of chickpeas a day. Like, I like chickpeas. I don't know if I'd want to eat like a bunch of them. You know what I mean? Lentils. Okay. Oh yeah, you can make hummus. Yeah, yeah, yeah. But like, in terms of a staple food, I would prefer black kidney or pinto beans to chickpeas. It just feels like I could eat a bunch of them without feeling like sick of them. I've never actually had lentils, so I can't really say. Peas, I don't like peas. I just don't. Kidney beans, there we go. Kidney beans are better than pinto beans and black beans. Yes, River killed the doctor quite a bit. 13 grams of protein, some fiber, some vitamin B9, B1, manganese, copper, and iron. Well, that's nice. And then black beans. Okay. Black beans seem to have way more protein. 172 grams to 15 grams of protein versus 256 grams of kidney beans to 13 grams of protein. That's like 50% more protein. Holy shit. Wait, then isn't this better? Wouldn't having more protein be better? I guess it's lower in fiber. No, it's not lower in fiber. It's higher in fiber. Wait, are black beans just better? Wait. Soy! Pinto beans? Navy beans. I don't know if I've had navy beans. Oh, peanuts. Navy beans. If they're not blue, I'm going to be disappointed. I am disappointed. Well, wait, hold on. They've got kind of a... Do you guys feel like they have a blue tint, maybe? Nah, it's a yellow tint. I'm coping. Nah, that's not... Well, maybe when they're cooked? No, they're like a very light brown when they're cooked. I've never had navy beans. White? What, me? No, you're legit, like, whiter than me. You are absolutely pastier than I am. I get more of a tan. Oh, the beans. Oh, okay. I was saying, I get enough of a tan from the UV radiation from my monitors. That's all I need. Navy beans are great. I just haven't had them. You know what I've always been a big fan of? The Japanese peanuts. There's a market in Los Angeles where you can get these. And they're so fucking good, dude. I've talked about these on stream before. Okay. So here is a photo that is on Amazon that, if I'm looking at this correctly, seems to have been photoshopped in strange ways that I can't fully understand. I have no idea. This looks like a magic eye puzzle, and it's starting to give me a headache. But these are Japanese peanuts. Let me see if I can find an image. Yeah, did they use like a fucking fisheye lens for an up-close picture of food? Here, let me find a photo that isn't... There we go. Thank God. Jesus. Yeah, 4K ray tracing on the beans. Yeah, it does look like a game texture, but here we go. These are Japanese peanuts. They have like this rice shell on the outside, and on the inside they just have a regular unsalted peanut. The rice shell has a very slight sweet flavor, and they're very hard, like you have to really bite into them, and then you get the savory peanut on the inside. It's very good. I'm a big fan. Big fan of them. Tooth chippers. Oh, you gotta bite. You gotta bite them down. Yeah, you gotta get your molars in on that. Gotta get them. Will these be the currency of the apocalypse? Maybe. Super good with wasabi. I don't know if I've had them with wasabi, but I could totally believe those are good. All right. Look at indigenous cultivars. They're good for pre-industrial sustenance farming. The fuck is this shit? God damn. No wonder we beat indigenous people everywhere all the time. What the fuck is this? They were powered by weird beans. How do you eat beans? They're so damn hard to crunch and don't even taste good. I'm going to assume that's a joke, but just in case you've been living a very difficult life up until this point, you have to cook the beans. I don't know if that's a joke. There's a very slight possibility that it's not a joke, and I'm doing this. This is an act of public service. But you have to cook the beans in order to eat them. Though I don't think I've actually ever had fresh beans. I always have canned beans. I'm gonna keep it real with you guys. Canned beans are great. Maybe I would have tried fresh beans by now if I ever at any point while eating canned beans felt this could be better. This feels like a synthetic version of like an authentic product, but I've never felt that way. When I eat black beans from the can and I put them in like the pot and I add some salt, some pepper, some hot sauce, you know, what have you, stir it for a bit, let it thicken and then have it, like that just it tastes like great. Like I don't feel like I'm missing out. Maybe I am. Maybe like fresh beans are fucking amazing and I just don't even know, but yeah. You are? Beans are usually dried then rehydrated. So yeah. Well, canning was pretty revolutionary for a reason, Vaush. Yeah, it's been known to be helpful. Some beans are better fresh, but it's not worth it. Yeah. Oh, yeah, I guess we should read donos and like actually continue with the stream. I didn't expect the conversation with Rose Wrist and the subsequent chat discussion to take up 3 hours of a 4-hour stream. What did I put in the stream title? Nothing? Drama, possibly? That's it? There's not even anything interesting to go over. Have you guys gone over the Vaush pit video? I want drama, please, God. Oh, it feels like going through the motions. The Vaush pit video was good. I feel like I, in a very good faith and intellectual manner, broke down why Destiny is actually Rapestiny. The drama's really foul. It's a little bit foul. Doomer, pill me harder. Fury? We're not doing Fury right now. Jesus. All right, I'll give you guys the rundown. Jesus. Okay. I'm not really drama baiting here. I'll just sort of factually recount the information at hand. Hold on. Here we go. This is somebody that we've actually had on stream before, which is, you know, a little unfortunate. But anyway, Cherry was essentially